So good morning, everyone. My name is ZRINKA STAHULJAK. I am professor of comparative literature and French here at UCLA and director of CMRS Center for Early Global Studies, founded in 1963 as the Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies, and since this September 2021, Center for Early Global Studies, or CEGS. The center has long promoted and sustained transdisciplinary studies of the period from late antiquity to the early modern era. And since 2019, Center's interests spatially cover the globe, making connections beyond Europe that are true to the time period under our coverage, from Africa to the Pacific Rim and to the Central, East, and Southeast Asia. CMRS-CEGS also respectfully acknowledges our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples. As a land-grant institution, we pay our respects to the Honukwetam, Ahihirom, and Eyonhikem, past, present, and emerging. To structure the polyvalent and multifaceted inquiry of the center's diverse faculty who study various areas of the globe, we adopted 5 research axes. They are sustainability, repurposing, fluidity, permanence, bodies, performance, conversion, mobility, and communication archive. Organized neither spatially nor temporally, but methodologically, the 5 research axes operate in line with CMRS-CEGS's commitment to approach all areas of the world as equally epistemologically and methodologically productive, including those that have been underrepresented or understudied. Methodological connections and disciplinary intersections place unconnected parts of the world into dialogue, while they also give us a basis to contrast the knowledge of the unconnected worlds with the parallel and slow emergence of a pre-modern and early modern connected world system that begins in the periods under the purview of the center. When we first began talking about the center's shift to the inclusive study of all the parts of the globe and the different regional world systems that they constitute, all under the purview of the center's time span from the 3rd to the 17th century Common Era, one of the first conversations that I had in 2019 was with Professors ANDREA MOUDARRES and TORQUIL DUTHIE. As we looked ahead, year 1521 seemed important for many reasons, several of which 2021 seemed very important for many reasons, and several of which CMRS-CEGS marked last February with a conference entitled 1521, Making the World While Breaking the World, which is available on our podcast page. 1521 was important for 2021 because of conquest and destruction of Tenochtitlan, Magellan's death and still incomplete circumnavigation of the globe, excommunication of Martin Luther. But also 2021 was important because it was going to be 700 years since Dante Alighieri's death. How might we appropriately celebrate a watershed achievement, mark an important date, and yet rise beyond the gesture of commemoration and create conditions for a novel and fruitful conversation among fields that have been disconnected until now? I am grateful to Professors MOUDARRES and DUTHIE and their select group of guests, including the 2 respondents, Professor Schildgen and Professor Lakota, whom I welcome to UCLA campus, grateful for providing us with a set of answers to new questions within the framework of the new CMRS-CEGS. Thank you, welcome everyone, and please welcome Professors MOUDARRES and DUTHIE and their guests.
Thank you, ZRINKA, and of course, thank you, TORQUIL, the staff of the CMRS, especially Erin Romo, who's been wonderful in managing the planning of the conference, and of course, the speakers without whom the conference would not exist, as well as everybody in attendance. So thanks, everybody. I mean, ZRINKA already explained more eloquently than I could possibly do the sort of origin of the conference. I mean, I think it's a good way to celebrate or memorialize this sort of the 7th centennial of Dante's death, while at the same time embracing the spirit of the new center previously Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies, now Center for Early Global Studies. So we thought that this could be an excellent platform to sort of contemplate dialogue between Dante and Buddhism. As I think Vittorio Montemaggi's paper will make plain today, a significant source of inspiration for this conference was the work of Christian Moevs in the Metaphysics of Dante's Comedy, where this is one of the most influential books in modern Dante scholarship, and deals tangentially with Eastern religions as well. I imagine that in the dissertation, that section was far bigger than what it turned out to be in the book, but publication needs had to be heeded. And so there was a sort of a keystone in in the original idea for the planning of this conference. I very much look forward to all the papers that will be presented. I am really excited about all of them. And again, I thank everybody for participating in the planning and for being in attendance. And TORQUIL will moderate the first day of the conference. I will do the same tomorrow. Okay, thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I'm DUTHIE. I teach pre-modern Japanese literature here in the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures at UCLA. This is, for those of you who are in LA, this is a very unseasonably warm day in LA. It's 86 degrees, 30 degrees Celsius for those of you who don't do Fahrenheit. And those of you who are elsewhere, thank you everybody for coming, for attending, and especially to our presenters. As Andrea said, I'm going to be moderating this first day of our conference, Afterlives, Dante in Dialogue with East Asian Buddhism. And I'm going to introduce each speaker in turn before they speak. So each speaker will speak for approximately 40 minutes. We will take some short breaks, perhaps, in the middle. And then at the end of that, our discussant will wrap up in the discussion, then we'll open it up to questions. So our speakers today are Vittorio Montemaggi from King's College London, Lucia Dolce from SOAS, University of London, Andrew Hui from Yale University-NUS College, and our discussant Diego Logota from our department here of Asian Languages and Cultures at UCLA. So first of all, our first presenter, Vittorio Montemaggi, is reader in literature, religion, and the arts at King's College London, and he's also director of the Von Hugel Institute for Critical Catholic Inquiry at St. Edmund's College in Cambridge. His work focuses primarily on the intersection of theology and the arts. He's written widely on Dante's Commedia, and is currently particularly interested in engaging with the Commedia theologically in the light of contemporary concerns with mental health, social justice, and interreligious dialogue. His work also engages with authors as different as Primo Levi, Shakespeare, Roberto Benigni, Catherine of Siena, and Gregory the Great. So without any further ado, I'd like to welcome Vittorio Montemaggi.
Thank you very much for this kind and generous welcome. Thank you for this wonderful invitation. It's a special pleasure to be here. I will try to share my screen. It worked a few minutes ago when we tried it, so it should work now as well. Everyone can see the presentation. Excellent. So thank you again. It is a special pleasure and indeed a privilege to be here, to have the opportunity of participating in this important conference, which focuses on a topic, Dante in Dialogue with East Asian Buddhism, that is extremely significant, both in itself and in its far-reaching implications. My own paper explores the latter. I cannot claim expertise in East Asian Buddhism and will thus be reflecting on the first part of the conference's stated focus, Dante in Dialogue. I will do so in close conversation with the work of Christian Moevs, and in particular with his groundbreaking monograph, The Metaphysics of Dante's Comedy, published by Oxford University Press and the American Academy of Religion in 2005. As explained in our conference's own statement of purpose, It is in significant measure, and as Andrea was reminding us just a few moments ago, it is in significant measure thanks to the perspectives opened up by Moevs' work that our present gathering is possible. Allow me to quote the conference's online description, as it provides the central context for my own reflections today. I don't have this on a slide, but this is the conference's presentation. In the Metaphysics of Dante's Comedy, one of the most significant contributions on Dante's thought in modern scholarship, Christian Moevs presents an interpretation of the Florentine poet's worldview that is consistent with Eastern spirituality. Moevs' allusion to non-dualistic principles of Indian and Asian religion and thought in the context of an in-depth examination of Dante's metaphysics offers the opportunity to advance a productive inquiry that may bridge conventional divides between medieval literature in Europe and cultural productions in medieval East Asia, especially on questions of eschatology and justice. The convergence between these two distant traditions is prompting us, in coincidence with the 7th centennial of Dante's death in our year 2021, to organize a conference that seeks to explore differences and similarities between these visions of the afterlife while avoiding the traps of facile parallels. So, taking the lead from the conference's own stated framework, my paper will converge with Christian Moevs' book, with a particular interest in highlighting how it opens up possibilities for dialogue across different cultural and spiritual traditions. In particular, I will focus on non-duality as presented by Moevs in his book, and on some of the challenges it presents to intellectual frameworks often employed in scholarly work, and in particular in scholarship on the Commedia. Through this, I wish to highlight the potential for radical openness to dialogue and encounter inherent in Dante's Commedia. As I have already suggested in my book, Reading Dante's Commedia as Theology, Divinity Realized in Human Encounter, among the great gifts offered us by Moevs' work are the profound perspectives it opens up onto Dante's conception of human personhood as manifestation of truth, thereby also opening up for us with unprecedented brilliance the possibility of thinking about human encounter as itself manifestation of truth or embodiment of divine love. Building on these suggestions, I would like in the present paper to reflect in more detail on some of the central principles animating Moevs' study and their implications for interpreting eschatology and justice as presented by Dante in the Commedia. In particular, I will explore the potential relative to dialogue of the challenges presented by non-duality to some prominent assumptions concerning salvation and concerning the possibility of speaking about it that are often brought to interpretation of the Commedia. Arguably, said challenges are ones Dante himself was well aware of. It could indeed be argued that one of the defining features of the Commedia are the tensions and dynamic interplay between a fundamental commitment to non-duality and the non-dualistic understanding of the relationship between creator and creation, and an equally fundamental commitment to individual particularity, and especially to the particularity of the individual artistic skill in and through which Dante articulates his vision of the afterlife. Said tensions are also highlighted in a substantial and important 2008 review of Moevs' book by William Franke. According to Franke, Dante's commitment to human particularity, and especially to articulating his own particular vision of both human and divine justice, is such that it remains ultimately, to some extent, incompatible with a full commitment to non-duality. And this is an extremely important perspective, as it highlights the need to acknowledge unresolved dualistic residues in Dante's work, as well as helping us identify these, especially in the structured and binary representation of damnation and salvation presented by the Commedia. Here, I wish to take a slightly different approach and suggest that the tension between non-duality and human particularity in the Commedia can be fruitfully interpreted relative to the tension between humility and pride, and that as such, we can see Dante's strong commitment to particularity as not antithetical to non-duality, but as part of Dante's active exploration of it, with all that that entails, including existential tensions that cut right through to the core of his being. The mystery towards which the Commedia moves, and in which it famously ends, is indeed that of the non-duality between divinity and human embodied particularity. I'll be reading from the Italian, but the slides have the English. Hopefully it should be easy enough to follow, but do stop me at any point if you'd like me to pause and go through things again. Quella circolazione che sì concetta pareva in te come il lume riflesso dagli occhi miei alquanto circonspetta, dentro da sé del suo colore stesso, mi parve pinta della nostra effigie, perché il mio viso in lei tutto era messo. Qual è il geometra che tutto s'affige per misurarlo cerchio e non ritrova, pensando quel principio ond'egli indige? Tale era io a quella vista nova. Veder voleva come si convenne l'imago al cerchio e come vi s'indova, ma non eran da ciò le proprie penne, se non che la mia mente fu percossa da un fulgore in che sua voglia venne. All'alta fantasia qui mancò possa, ma già volgeva il mio disio il velle, sì come rota che ugualmente è mossa, l'amor che muove il sole e le altre stelle. So these are the closing lines of the Paradiso, the closing lines of Dante's Commedia. And in these closing lines of the poem, it is in Dante's being overcome by the inability to comprehend the truth of incarnate human being, clearly recognizable in divinity, yet inscribed in it in nothing other than divinity's own color. It's in the impossibility of understanding this that Dante finds himself perfectly at one with divine love. Such union, as perfect non-dualistic embodiment of that which Dante is dualistically unable to comprehend, is thus also perfect fulfillment of humility, in which the human person is not ultimately erased, yet also recognized as being what it is, only insofar as it is a manifestation of the love in which all that is. Pride and humility are not often the explicit focus of reflection in Moevs' study of Dante's metaphysics. Yet, it is through the latter that I have come to recognize just how central reflection on pride and humility is for engaging with non-duality in Dante's Commedia. And I'm profoundly grateful to Moevs for many hours of conversation, which have helped me explore the implications of all this. And this is part of what my work is growing from. Here, in this regard, I wish in particular to highlight some of the key principles which govern Moevs' work and which, Moevs argues, are a defining characteristic not just of Dante's metaphysics, but of Western philosophy and theology up to and including Dante's time. Quoting from Moevs, Dante's metaphysics and the cosmology that embodies them are, of course, not just his. With their roots in Plato and Aristotle, they undergird much of the Western philosophical tradition to his time and frame all later medieval Christian thought. I shall treat 5 principles, Moevs says, that are fundamental to grasping the world picture Dante shared with the profound thinkers of his age, and that form the basis for understanding the comedy's purposes and poetics as Dante might have. These principles are that 1, the world of space and time does not itself exist in space and time. It exists in intellect, the empyrean, pure conscious being. 2, matter in medieval hylomorphism is not something material. It is a principle of unintelligibility, of alienation from conscious being. 3, all finite form, that is, all creation, is a self-qualification of intellect or being, and only exists insofar as it participates in it. 4, creator and creation are not two, since the latter has no existence independent of the former, but of course, creator and creation are not the same. And finally, 5, God, as the ultimate subject of all experience, cannot be an object of experience. To know God is to know oneself as God, or, if the expression seems troubling, as one with or in God. So, principles 1 to 3 set, as it were, the metaphysical scene for reflection on non-duality in the Commedia. There is ultimately nothing other than divine existence or pure conscious being. Only divine existence is self-subsistent, and all that exists only exists as expression of it. Even matter, by which existent things might appear to have an existence that is concretely independent of divine existence, is nothing other than a metaphysical principle with no ontological status independent of pure conscious being. Matter is itself one of the ways in which pure conscious being qualifies itself in and as creation, insofar that is, as it is one of the ways finite form manifests itself. In short, there is no being other than God's being. The perception of being as other than God's being is itself one of the ways in which divine being manifests itself. In and as finite conscious being, however, creation can become aware of itself as nothing other than divine being, as both finite form and as nothing other than resplendence of divine love. As Dante puts it in Paradiso 29, one of the cantos examined in most detail by Moevs in his book, non per aver a sé di bene acquisto ch'esser non può, ma perché suo splendore potesse risplendendo dir subsisto, in sua eternità di tempo for d'ogni altro comprender, come i piacque, saperse in nuovi amor, l'eterno amore. This passage prepares for Dante's final vision in Paradiso 33, which we saw earlier. Created conscious being most fully recognizes the truth of its own being by recognizing itself both as itself and, as such, nothing other than self-expression of divine being. It is in the paradoxical spiritual energy inherent in this realization that, relative to Dante's metaphysics, we can locate the root of the tension between humility and pride, between that which, according to Dante, allows us to move in conscious union with God and others, and the illusion that we can be independent of this union. Differently put, in reflecting on non-duality as presented to us in the Commedia, it might be helpful to draw a distinction between how Dante might have thought of the ultimate nature of reality and how he engages with the experience of reality. That is, between non-duality as metaphysical principle and negotiating the necessary duality inherent in human experience, thought, and communication. In this respect, Moevs's principles number 4 and 5 point in a particularly sharp way to what is at stake in reflecting on the challenges of non-duality, relative especially to the interplay between pride and humility. Principle 4 both articulates a key idea in Dante's metaphysics, creator and creation are not two, and points to its relevance for spiritual journeying by identifying a metaphysical predicament that can also be seen as naming the spiritual tightrope that, according to Dante, human beings are on in trying to move towards God. Creator and creation are not the same. How can we truthfully maintain a sense of distinction between creator and creation if ultimately there is no duality between the two? A name that can accurately be given to this spiritual tightrope is humility. That is, an active exercise of individual character that does not falter into ascribing to that individuality any self-subsistence other than as participation in and expression of divinity itself. Such faltering is pride, and as implied in principle number 5, pride is at one with the illusion that God might be known as object of experience, the illusion that human existence and knowing can ultimately be something other than participation in divine existence and knowing. As Moevs puts it throughout his study, such illusion eclipses truth. It does not allow truth consciously to awaken in and as oneself. Yet, as suggested by the parentheses in Principle 5, if the expression seems troubling, pride can in fact mask itself as humility. There is something that feels radically daring in saying that our being and our knowing are nothing other than divine being and knowing. And it might indeed appear more humble to assert our individuality as something other than God, in the name of maintaining a distinction between creator and creation. Yet to do this is to assert that there can be some manifestation of being that can subsist independently of God. And in this metaphysical scheme, this would be a contradiction in terms. A significant aspect of walking this spiritual tightrope, that is the active exercise in humility, is therefore to have the confidence to assert that our individuality is, as such, manifestation of divinity. In this sense, non-duality and individuality are not mutually exclusive. The journey depicted by Dante in the Commedia in these respects is not a journey towards the ultimate erasure of individuality in God, but rather a journey towards realization of individuality as nothing other than expression of the non-dual truth in and as which all that is. I became more aware of this aspect of Moevs' work through comments that he offered in conversation on a striking passage in Roberto Benigni's interpretation of Paradiso 33, and especially of Dante's reference in the canto to seeing in the light, which is God, the whole of creation bound up as one in love. Nel suo profondo vidi che s'interna, legato con amore in un volume, ciò che per l'universo si squaderna, sustanze, accidenti e lor costume, quasi conflati insieme per tal modo che ciò che dico è un semplice lume. In Benigni's interpretation of these lines, we find a striking example of how we might emphasize both God as the only true reality and the true reality of all that exists in God, including human individual subjectivity, sentience, and relationality. Here I go directly to the translation. There is a point, which is that of God, from which one sees everything always. There, in the eternal moment in which Dante saw in the light of God, he saw eternity since always in everything. He saw all of our infancies, he saw the skies of all the worlds, he saw the loves that did not come to fruition and those which have just blossomed. He saw all of our lives, he saw us here this evening speaking about him. He saw Julius Caesar on his horse. He was Caesar's horse. He saw the hoof of Caesar's horse, the earth where the hoof of Caesar's horse hit the trodden grass. He was the grass. He was the grass under the hoof of Caesar's horse. He heard the thud of a chestnut falling in October. He saw all the courage which was not fulfilled. He saw the flowers that grew in places where no one ever set eye or hand. He saw some apple trees that grew in silence without saying anything to anyone for eternity, for all the years that they were supposed to grow. He saw the eyes of a tiger. He saw every leaf of every tree. He was that leaf of every tree. He saw a fox scaring a rabbit with its teeth while it snaps at it. He was the teeth of the fox. He was the blood of the rabbit. He was the blood cells of that rabbit. He was inside every insect of the world. He saw the life of every insect in the world. And so even why they were born and why there had to be all the insects in the world and all the kinds of life in the world. Every petal, he smelled all the perfumes of existence and of the universe. He saw every kind of light. He was that light. He was that perfume. He was all these things together in that moment. He saw the whole world. It's there, an eternal moment, immeasurable. So I think it's fair to say that Benigni's words strikingly differ from the way in which we're used to commenting on Paradiso 33, 85 to 90. Dante's vision of the whole of creation. Yet, in at least one significant respect, Benigni's words are most penetrating than most commentaries, namely that they can be taken as offering a helpful gloss to the metaphysical principles that Moevs highlights in his analysis of Dante's Metaphysics. In particular, Benigni's words reveal our short-sightedness if we read Paradiso 33, lines 85 to 90, simply as a vision of Dante's, a vision on Dante's part of all there is in creation. To think of Dante's vision in this way, according to the terms of Moevs' analysis, would be to eclipse truth. It would be to miss the point that to see all there is in some sense also to be all there is. If this weren't the case, one simply couldn't see all there is to see. As just expressed, we might seem to have reached a point that is uncomfortably far from Christian doctrine, as Dante might have understood it or articulated it. We also seem to be quite far from strict non-duality. Yet we need to remember that this is still only a phase in Dante's journey, part of what still prepares him for final perfect union with divine love, in which the Commedia ends. We also need to note that while Benigni's words refer to a long list of aspects of existence and experience other than what Dante presents us in the Commedia, and might thus appear to be rather alien from Dante's own vision, they do seem to capture an interrelational dynamism that is in fact an essential element of the narrative of the Paradiso. As Dante points out throughout his journey, doing so with particular intensity in the cantos of the Heaven of Venus, in and through God, the life of the community of the blessed is characterized by mutual interpenetration. While retaining their individuality, and ultimately this will mean at the resurrection their embodied particularity, all of the blessed are perfectly transparent to each other. They each see what the other sees, think what the other thinks. In this sense too, there is no ultimate duality. Not only is human individuality nothing other than manifestation of divine being and love, it is also radically not individualistic. If it is true that there is no aspect of my being that is not a participation in and manifestation of divine being, it is also true that there is no aspect of my being that, in and through God, is not also perfectly visible or at one with the being of everyone else. Indeed, the paradox in which the journey of the Commedia culminates, the incarnate human being recognizable in God, though painted in the same color as God, is essentially communal. We return to these lines. Dentro da sé, del suo colore stesso, mi parve pinta della nostra effigie, perché il mio viso in lei tutto era messo. What Dante sees is not simply Christ's image or his own image, but our image, nostra effigie, the particular incarnate image of the whole of humanity. Not humanity in general, but humanity in particular. And this all brings me to the central idea concerning Moevs' work that I'd like to propose in the present context, namely that it is not only because Moevs takes non-duality as object of scholarly exploration that his work opens up possibilities for dialogue between Dante and East Asian Buddhism. Moevs' focus on non-duality as intellectual practice and as fruitful challenge to conventional scholarly frameworks helps us recognize in Dante a resource for dialogue that transcends the particular ideological frameworks inherent in his work. Such ideological frameworks are indeed inherently dualistic and, relative to the questions of eschatology and justice, appalling. They certainly do not seem to leave very much room for dialogue, especially of an interreligious kind. Dante seems to display throughout his poem, not just in the Inferno, a tendency towards exclusion of the other, a tendency that goes against the openness to encounter required by fruitful dialogue. For example, in the central cantos of the Paradiso, we find Dante to be vehemently against immigration, spoken of as polluting Florence's Christian purity. And in the same section of the Commedia, reference is made to Islam as a foul usurper of Christianity, against whom the violence of the Crusades is justified. Elsewhere in the Paradiso, Jews are referred to as antagonistically subordinate to Christians and as deserving suffering and displacement for having killed Christ. We might be tempted to try and explain away these appalling passages by saying that they are simply a product of Dante's time and not a defining aspect of his particular worldview. That won't work, given how carefully and prominently placed these passages appear to be in the narrative and argumentative structures of the Paradiso. And in any case, the tendency towards exclusion of the other that is evident in the passages just referred to seems even more clearly integrated into the architecture of the Commedia as a whole, especially through the Inferno, which can be read as the result of Dante's presumption, pride, to damn fellow human beings, presenting them as excluded from salvation and beatitude. How is it possible then for us responsibly to speak of the Commedia as a resource for dialogue? An important step in this direction is to reflect, I think, on the relationship between truth and fiction. As Moevs compellingly argues in the final section of his book, to read the Commedia in a way that is consistent with the metaphysical principles underpinning it is to undermine distinctions between truth and fiction that almost invariably are brought to bear on interpretation of the poem, whereby truth is aligned not with being itself, but with its historical manifestation, and fiction aligned with poetic invention rather than alienation from conscious being. As Moevs puts it in language that recalls especially principle number 5 of the metaphysical principle discussed earlier, a narrative is true or real that embodies, mediates, or unveils the ultimate subject or ground of experience. This can only mean that through such a narrative, the divine, reflected in or as the intelligence of the reader, recognizes itself and awakens to itself. Thus, the comedy presents itself as the presenter, not representer, of God's own self-revelation through word and image. In other words, if we read the Commedia ultimately as attempting to offer objective description of divine judgment, we are fundamentally misreading it, eclipsing its deeper meaning, preventing it from arising in and as ourselves. In the sense just outlined, we might say that Dante is himself the first to misread his work, to presume his particular judgments to coincide with divine judgment. At the same time, it is possible to read the Commedia as dramatizing precisely Dante's gradual awakening from the dark wood of Inferno 1 to union with God in Paradiso 33, awakening to himself as nothing other than embodiment of divine love. Such awakening is not just literal, but meta-literal, insofar as it involves the gradual recognition of poetry as expression of pride, towards realizing or attempting to realize poetry as expression of humility. On Moevs' reading, Dante's poem doesn't simply offer a particular representation or description of the afterlife that is informed by a metaphysics ultimately defined by non-duality. Rather, Dante's poem dramatizes the gradual awakening of the human self to its own divinity. Such awakening entails the descent into the embodiment of pride in the Inferno, the painful and joyful training in humility of the Purgatorio, and the blissful sweetness of union with divine love in the Paradiso. The human self that gradually awakens to its own divinity on such journey is not just Dante's as character, poet, human being, but also potentially our own, that of any human being open to realizing in themselves and others nothing other than divinity. Such recognition presents a challenge to conventional scholarly practice, both specifically relative to interpretation of the Commedia and more generally. It requires us to acknowledge in Dante's poetry both human finitude and limitation, and manifestation of divine love. It requires reading the Commedia not simply as an object under examination, but as encounter with a poetic voice, consciously tending towards its being transparent to the ultimate subject or ground of experience, which in turn can only happen to the degree that we ourselves consciously tend in the same direction. We could thus say that, thus conceived, the Commedia ultimately is essentially an exercise in dialogue. As with the human encounters that constitute the narrative of the Commedia, the poem requires a gradual abandonment of identifying ourselves and truth with ideas and ideologies, towards gradual recognition of ourselves and others as manifestation of divinity not as something that is ultimately in competition with individual particularity, but as that in which the truth of particularity is found. And such truth is found only in and through dialogue, being open to recognizing the divinity of the human person as such, and of any human person we might meet on our way. In Paradiso 21, the pilgrim Dante is told by one of the blessed that no creature can see as God sees, not even the seraph closest to God. The reference to the seraph closest to God can be read as an implicit reference to Lucifer, the seraph closest to God, whose fall in the theology of the Commedia is the result of his pride, of his presumption to be like God, and is the origin of hell. In other words, the pride that is integrally structured into the architecture of the Commedia is, on the Commedia's own theological terms, akin to the fall of Lucifer and the origin of hell. So, as counterintuitive as it might be, one of the central features of the poem, that is, its author's attempt to judge fellow human beings as God might judge them, is thus implicitly but remarkably presented as significant moral and spiritual failing. Perhaps this is what Dante already has in mind when in Purgatorio 13, the pilgrim expresses fear at the time he says he will have to spend purging his pride in purgatory after he dies. Be that as it may, the pilgrim's response in Paradiso 21 to being told that not even the seraph closest to God can see as God sees is extremely significant and opens up one of the most important moments of encounter in the Commedia. Dante realizes he was so intent on understanding the divine will, on seeing as God sees, that he had neglected to consider who the human being before him is. We then find some of the most significant lines in the poem. Si mi prescrisser le parole sue, ch'io lasciai la questione e mi ritrassi a dimandarla umilmente chi fue. The pursuit of truth here passes from pride and the presumption to possess godlike knowledge to the humility inherent in being genuinely open to encountering other human beings. And Dante will find out the human being he is speaking with is Peter Damian. And this all sheds light on the Commedia as a whole, a narrative poem composed entirely of human encounters, leading to union with love that moves the sun and other stars. Seen in the light of Dante's encounter with Peter Damian in Paradiso 21, Dante's presumption, pride, to judge fellow human beings can thus be seen both as serious failing and, if acknowledged as such, a compelling invitation to humility, a journey towards recognizing that encountering other human beings is not subordinate to our journey towards truth, but coincides with it, leading to infinite love. Moreover, we could say that in this sense, dialogue intended not simply as exchange of ideas or transaction of information, but as living openness to encounter with truth as residing in both ourselves and others, dialogue in this sense is itself non-dualistic, embodiment of divine love. Eschatologically, the fulfillment of dialogue thus intended can be imagined, for instance, as the community of the Empyrean represented by Dante, perfect fulfillment of justice insofar as all are given their due in mutual interpenetrability, as nothing other than manifestations of divine love. Such imagining in the Commedia as expression of Dante's not yet perfectly redeemed pride remains imperfect. Yet, if acknowledged as such, engaging with it can itself be seen as further stage in our own dialogues towards truth. In this sense, acknowledgement of the pride inherent in Dante's dualistic judgment of fellow human beings as either damned or saved can itself become part of our own reflections on our own pride, on those intellectual, cultural, and religious divisions with which we continue to identify at the expense of recognizing truth in others non-dualistically. Moevs's The Metaphysics of Dante's Comedy certainly provides a brilliant reading of Dante's poem that, by taking non-duality as key object of analysis, provides unprecedented opportunities for placing Dante in dialogue with East Asian Buddhism. This is extremely significant and valuable in itself, and as this conference attests, already transcends conventional scholarly and disciplinary boundaries. Beyond this, moreover, Moevs's work, by challenging conventional scholarly frameworks and encouraging us not only to think of non-duality in Dante's work, but also to engage non-dualistically with Dante's poem as occasion for human encounter with Dante and with ourselves, Moevs offers us the opportunity of recognizing in Dante, not despite, but through the pride inherent in his imagining of divine justice and his disparaging treatment of other human beings and of religious traditions other than his own, an ultimate kind of commitment to human encounter, and therefore also a resource for dialogue that can help us both identify and genuinely transcend the divisions that in the academy and beyond continue to prevent us from recognizing truth in each other as profoundly as we could, and as we ultimately owe each other as fellow human beings. There is, arguably, no exercise in interpretation that is more important than that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vittorio, for such a wonderful and thought-provoking talk. Yes, we sort of like that on Zoom. If you don't mind, if Lucia, you're ready, and we're going to sort of proceed straight into the next talk. Lucia Dolce is Numata Professor of Japanese Buddhism at SOAS, University of London, and also chair of the SOAS Center of Buddhist Studies and the Center for Japanese Religions there. Her work combines archival research, textual analysis, and fieldwork to explore hermeneutical practices of East Asian Buddhism and the performative and visual dimension of religion in Japan, with a focus on the medieval period. She's published extensively on various different Buddhist traditions, and from the Lotus Sutra and its Tendai and Nichiren interpretations to Tantric Buddhism, and also on Shinto Buddhist combinatory cults. Her current research project draws on unpublished documents that have recently been uncovered in Japanese temples to map out the Buddhist discourse on ritual body, namely how medieval monks articulated a fundamental Buddhist notion of duality and its overcoming by reconceptualizing the human body in ritual and visual terms. And today she's going to talk about hells, prophets, and the end of time, eschatological concerns in medieval Japanese Buddhism. So without any further ado, Lucia Dolce.
Thank you, TORQUIL, for this wonderful presentation. Introduction. I feel like I'm a bit a fish out of the place here because I'm not a specialist in Dante, and which well, you must have guessed as much. But after listening to Vittorio, I just thought that I should have given a different type of paper, absolutely different, and speaking about duality and non-duality in well, in the metaphysics of Buddhism, which is what I'm working on more recently. However, I'm going to talk about something else today. So let me share my, oh, disappeared. Can I share? I could share it earlier. Okay. So yes, I will be talking about dualistic thinking, perhaps, rather than non-dualistic one. But I want to say that I'm very, I was delighted to be invited to this conference, because on the other hand, I do think that there are a lot of parallels between the world of the Buddhist world of the specific Asian area that I'm working on, Japan, and the world of medieval Italy. So despite the distinct religio-philosophical systems, I would be as bold as to argue that there are more similarities than divergences between these two cultural worlds. And here, for the purpose of this discussion, I use medieval to indicate the period that goes from the late 11th to the early 16th century, which is a period in Japan of struggles, religious ferments, and extraordinary literary productions. So there are similarities if one thinks of the devotional aspects of Buddhism, but there are also parallels that can be drawn from between individual writers or specific themes, for instance, in the Commedia. And many examples come to mind, and I thought I would voice some of these before I get into the details of my paper. We can start with the literary medium chosen by Dante, namely poetry, as an appropriate medium to explicate theological and political positions. Extensive discussions took place in medieval Japan on the extent to which poetry was suitable to convey the ultimate truth. While Buddhism traditionally held literature under suspicion and considered it disordered language and flowery words, and I'm quoting here, and the writing of poetry as one of the 10 evil deeds. Despite of this, medieval monastic writers turned this perception upside down and declared the way of poetry, in particular the way of Japanese poetry, waka, nothing less than the way of the Buddha. And therefore, to write poetry became a path to enlightenment. And here one can speak of a number of people, but Jian, an elite monk who lived in the 13th, between the 12th and the 13th century, who was a poet, and the politicians seem to be a wonderful parallel with Dante. He wrote exegetical poems on the Lotus Sutra, and did so to unveil the complexity of a doctrinal system, in this case, that of the what we can call Tendai theology. Like Dante as well, he was an active participant in the life of the city. Was a politically engaged poet, we could say, who wrote about the specific historical moment in which he and his country lived. Then we can think of themes in the narrative of the Commedia that resonate greatly with medieval Buddhism. For instance, the theme of exile, which surfaces in several medieval Japanese writers, but becomes constitutive in some of them. For instance, a monk I worked for a long time in my previous research called the Nichiren, again, another 13th century monk. Foremost, however, remains the content of the Commedia related to the illustration of the afterlife. Hells and paradises are a distinctive theme of the literary and visual production of medieval Japan, and descriptions similar to those of the Commedia were produced in large numbers and circulated in different media. Narrative stories, paintings, illustrated scrolls, filled with suffering and naked, body burning in flames, tortured by frightening demons, reminded viewers and listeners of the consequences of evil acts. The special construction of hells is division in types, the kind of punishment that were carried out, as almost exact parallels to the Commedia. Judgment was held by the king of hell, this guy called Emma in Japanese, Yama in Indian literature, and the accounts of the infallibility and fairness of the process of judgment reassured that whatever one might have gotten away with in this world, justice awaited in the next. In fact, the logic of the punishment inflicted worked in a way that may be similar to that of Dante's Contrapasso. Karmic, I'll leave it here. Karmic retribution was clearly based on an understanding of cause and effect that is different from that of Christian theology. But as it was understood in Japan, it did stress the role of the individual in determining his or her future abode. The question of individuality that Vittorio was mentioning in his paper is actually very interesting when thinking of it in relation to the Japanese hells. There are perhaps comparatively fewer historical individuals named in the Japanese hells, but some well-known monks did in fact send other monks into hell. And yeah, again, thinking of Nichiren, I think of a very important patriarch of Tantric Buddhism, Subhakara Simha, who was sent, who according to Nichiren was in the deepest of hells. So I don't want to talk much about health because I saw that Fabio is going to talk about it tomorrow. So I'll leave it a bit to that, and maybe in the discussion we can do more. Together with health came paradises. And maybe I'll show this one. Beings of this world sought salvation by the interventions of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, and this produces visions of paradise. They were imagined as pure lands, fields of merits would be the technical term of a Buddha, filled with precious gems as well as songs, music, and light. And these were the places where people who were so meritorious to be reborn could contemplate the Buddha, often in different degrees of beatitude. Clearly, the framework in which these images, these visions operate is that of Mahayana Buddhism. So we don't find one paradise, but we have several types of paradises, depending on the Buddha that presides to them. But the one that you see in the slide here, the Western paradise of the Buddha Amida is perhaps in popular perception the prototypical one, but you know, other Buddhas, Shakyamuni, Maitreya, had their own heavens, and people aspired to be reborn in these heavens. And I think an interesting term of comparison with with narratives of paradise, although not necessarily in the terms of Dante, are the narratives of individuals who achieved the rebirth in this land, in the paradise of Amida, and came back to tell what it was like, or at least they appeared in dreams or made known what was about. These are called ojoden in Japanese. They are kind of hagiographical stories that began in China and then appeared just before the medieval period in Japan, but multiplied in this period that I call the medieval period. They told about individuals whose diligence and practice resulted in this ultimate attainment to be reborn in paradise. So we can see that they are paradigmatic stories that blend the didactic and the doctrinal and served to encourage people to follow the same path. In fact, one very interesting point in the preface of these narratives, the Japanese narratives, is that it is suggested that the very act of writing or reading the account of persons who gained birth in the Pure Land would equal to establish karmic connections with them. In other words, authors as well readers and listeners could share the good karma of the protagonists. So these narratives may be seen as experiences of shared dreams and visions of rebirth. So these are a range of different examples that are, I think, open to discuss parallelism between Dante's world and medieval Japanese Buddhism. What I like to do in this this paper today is to explore these parallelism, these resonances, through the lenses of time. and consider the eschatological and millenarian nature of Japanese medieval thinking, which I think nurtured the imagery of the afterlife and bore significant consequences for how Buddhists interpreted their sociopolitical reality. I shall focus on a very well-known notion in the East Asian Buddhist context of the end of the Dharma, what is called in Japan as Mappo, Chinese Mofa, an eschatological notion which became almost constitutive of Japanese medieval period. And I will take clues from the writings of, in particular, of the monk I mentioned earlier, Nichiren, who was roughly a contemporary of Dante, some 40 years older than Dante. Now, eschatological notions do not seem to match the emphasis on immanence and on present time that is often invoked to represent East Asian Buddhism, nor the non-dualistic metaphysics that inform these immanentistic notions, and that is, in a sense, recalled in what Vittorio was telling about Dante. Eschatology usually expresses itself in dichotomic terms, for instance, emphasizing the duality of evil and good. Further, rather than the present, it seems to reflect on history, on the past, and engenders utopia. So it can be perceived to focus away from the present. But we will see that this is not really what happens with the Japanese writers. But let me first of all say some words more in general about the Buddhist conception of time. Maybe I'll leave it here. The general understanding of time in Buddhism follows a circular pattern, drawing on early Buddhist works such as the Abhidharma. According to the cosmology expressed in this text, time unfolds through 4 large periods called kalpas, large kalpas, which we can perhaps regard as 4 stages in the life of the universe through which each world undergoes. These are the kalpa of becoming, of existence, of destruction, and of emptiness. This is a cosmological system, a very grand vision, but it's a system that cyclically repeats itself. The kalpa of destruction begins when beings are no longer reborn in hells. When all beings disappear from hells, the hells themselves then vanish. And this kind of process is repeated for each type of being. When I say being in Buddhism, I don't mean only human beings, sentient beings, but a whole range of existences. When the karma of living being that created world is finally exhausted, because there are no more living beings in the world, then 7 suns appear and burn the so-called circle of wind, of water, and a golden earth layer, Mount Sumero, which is a kind of axis mundi in the Buddhist world, the 4 land masses, and the Brahma Palace, which is the highest point of the heavens. So that's how the world disappears. And what comes next is the kalpa of nothingness, in which the world remains dissolved for 20 long intermediate kalpas. Then the kalpa of becoming starts. It starts with a tiny wind that starts to blow through the indirect force of the karma of living beings. This is what the texts tell us, although it's not clear who are these living beings, since there was nobody there anymore. Then the elements forms the wind circle, the water circle, the golden earth layer, the 4 masses and Mount Sumer. And this is the kalpa of becoming. Finally, the kalpa of existing is where human activity unfolds. And this is a cycle that continues infinity. So this is a cyclical, a circular pattern that is made of repetition. Yet a different conception of time intersects this pattern, at least in East Asian Buddhism. This is the idea of the final age of the Dharma, Mappo, this idea of the end that I have mentioned. And it is often interpreted as the end of times with different terminology, which all starts with matsu, which means end. We may think of this as a linear model of time, which starts from a golden age and continues through staged developments in Buddhist teaching until an apocalyptic end. Ideas about the decline of Buddhism were systematized in China in what became known as the three-period theory, three-period paradigm you see here on the screen. According to this theory, the Buddha's demise is followed by 3 periods during which his teachings will gradually decline and eventually become extinguished. The first stage of this linear process of deterioration is the age of the perfect, correct Dharma, when teaching, the practices that are conducive to liberation, and the actualization of liberation all exist and are fruitful. During the next period, the period of the semblance Dharma, the latter two still exist, but there is no longer a possibility of liberation, of enlightenment. Finally, when the time of the final Dharma comes, only the teaching is still existent, but there is no liberation, there is no practice left. So this is the basic pattern that is used across East Asia, although different lengths of time are attributed to each period and different starting times. This is due to the fact that the different theories circulated about the year in which the Buddha passed away. Well, for instance, in Japan, the model that was used in the medieval period put the year of Buddha's death at 949 BC, and the 3 periods were understood to last respectively 1,000, 1,000, and 10,000 years. Accordingly, chronicles, including national chronicles, indicated the year 1052 as the first year of the final Dharma age. There are different ways of periodizing this according to different scriptures. One that we may want to remember here is also a 5-period theory that divides the same stages in 5 periods of 500 years. And so the beginning of the Mappo period would be the first period of 500 years. Anyway, these were the numbers that were circulated in and that we read in the literary productions of the time. So by the 13th century, the time in which the monk I wanted to talk about lived, Japan was well into Mappo. And Buddhist writers in different ways continuously reminded their readers and monks, their followers, of the particular time they were living. So it's interesting that there is this insistence in recognizing the time. And this is, this idea of the end, of the 3 periods and the end, becomes a paradigm through which both individual and national destinies are read. It underpins the sense of living in an evil world, among evil-natured monks who would advocate harmful practices, because that is what is described as the characteristic of the final Dharma in the scriptures. But it also intensifies the images of destruction of Buddhism and destruction of the country in socio-political terms. So there's this link, continuous link between individual destiny, individual fate, and the fate of the country and the fate of the entirety of Buddhism. Confirmation that the time of the end of the Dharma has arrived is sought in the canonical literature. And we find several passages in scriptures and in the writings of monks that preceded the medieval period that indicates that the period in which men are born with the 5 sins, the period in which great struggles will start, is the period of the final Dharma. In fact, several Buddhist scriptures have pretty apocalyptic tones. Scriptures such as the Great Collection Sutra that I have indicated down here, but also the Benevolent King Sutra, the Medicine King Sutra, all speak of 7 calamities, for example. They speak of more types of calamities, but especially of 7 types of calamities, which roughly cover, we could say, same areas of anxiety. There are calamities due to changes in the heavens, such as the apparition of a comet or an eclipse, storms, floods of season, pestilence, drought, but also wars and strifes, both within the country or concerning foreign enemies. Medieval readers draw on these scripture passages and transpose the projections of the scriptures into the reality of 13th century Japan. For instance, Nichiren, in a work that has an interesting title, is called Rishoan Kokuron, the treatise on how to pacify the country by establishing the correct form of Buddhism, writes that 5 of the 7 calamities that have already that are described in the scripture have already occurred, and only 2 remains to appear. That being the invasion by a foreign country and uprising within one's own domain. And he says that he has already observed many of these events unfolding in front of him. An earthquake, that storms and famine that followed in the Shoka period. These are periods of Japanese history. The epidemics of the Shogun period, they all look as omens that indicate that the worst of the 7 calamities are going to take place. In other words, the conflict mentioned in the scriptures are read to point out problems of one's own age. In the case of Nichiren, one of the most important event was the invasion of the Mongols. And this is what Nichiren says that the scriptures have already prophesied. And that, in a sense, it's interesting because also the life of some monks, again, as Nichiren, were affected by the struggle and by the conflict of the time. Nichiren was exiled twice before because of contrast within the monastic community, and also because of struggles within the larger community. So, all these these events seem to become irrefutable proof that Buddhism and the country of Japan has entered the last days. What does that mean? I think we should note at least 2 points in this logic. The first is that the latter days of the Dharma are not just identified as an inevitable cosmological process, but also as the outcome of human action, both within and without the Buddhist community, for instance, the invasion of the country. The second point is that medieval writers borrowed from the scriptures the idea that human action did play a role in determining the spiritual and secular state of the world, and applied that to the reality of medieval Japan. So several monastic writers state that to support the wrong teachings, the wrong Dharma, both as an individual followers and as a leader of the country, would bring about the prophesied political disasters and will destroy Buddhism. So the final age of the 3 periods of time was not an abstract temporal notion, but a specific historical geographical reality of the time and place where Nichiren and his contemporary lived. There are other eschatological notions that that come around and that have a very strong influence in Japan together with this one. But I think this can be illustrative, sufficiently illustrative of the understanding of and the urgency that is given by the moment in which these people lived. What is interesting is that the perception of the present moment as final did not result in a negative outlook into the world. Rather, what we find in several medieval writers is a re-evaluation of eschatological time as a time for change. Once again, the scriptures are used as evidence of this. A passage, oh, sorry, should be like this. Okay, I did it the other way around. Both of them, it's fine. Concentrate on the first one. The passage from the Lotus Sutra, from the chapter on the Medicine King of the Lotus Sutra, is often cited by various writers as a, we can call it a prophecy of the Buddha that assures the continuity of Buddhism. This passage says, after my extinction, within the latter 500 years, broadly proclaim and propagate the scripture in Jagdviva, which is the continent where human beings are, never allowing it to be extinguished. Chinese readers of the Lotus Sutra, within the tradition that Nichiren worked on, the Tiantai tradition, identified these latter 500 years with the 500 years in the period in the framework of the three moments of the decadence of the law, and they spoke already of the great benefits that would occur in these years. In turn, several Japanese scholar monks drew from the Tiantai tradition and applied that to the moment of the Kamakura period, the period in which they lived. This is not only, does not happen only with Nichiren, but also with a Zen monk called Eisai, that they both interpret the period of the decline of the Dharma as a decisive moment for Buddhas. This often means decisive for the propagation of the specific form of Buddhism that is advocated by individual monks, in the case of Yosai's Zen, in the case of Nichiren as Lotus Buddhist. But we have many of the major figures of this period positing Mappo, positing the final age as a time of opportunities. Another example that comes to mind is a monk called Moevs, who wrote the possibility of salvation by establishing a tie with the Buddha, who manifests himself in a form that is suitable to man's capacities in the final Dharma age. And in fact, even Pure Land writers had scriptural passages that brought hope in their bleak image of the end of this world. For instance, Honen, maybe the initiator of this important tradition in Japan, quotes from the Sutra of Visualization of the Buddha's immeasurable life, that where Shakyamuni says that in the future world, when the teachings of the sutra have disappeared, he will use his compassion towards the sentient beings and will let the sutra remain for yet another 100 years, so that sentient beings can encounter the sutra and attain salvation. So the scriptures basically worked both ways. There were passages that stressed the end of the world, but passages that opened up to the future. And these passages were used equally to make different points by medieval writers. So to understand how Japanese Buddhists reconfigured the eschatological time and turned around the evil consequences of the final age, we needed to take into account of other factors that play in the articulation of what I can call the positive eschatology. And two are particularly significant to our argument. The way in which retribution, karmic retribution, was linked to capacity, receptive capacity. And the second one is the meaning of history as the place of human and divine action. Let me start with the first. The relation between this notion of capacity, ki in Japanese, or receptive capacity maybe can be translated, that is the ability of people to understand the teaching. It's a kind of combined ability because it does incorporate karmic capacity, that is what you get already from the karma, but also includes a degree of individual ability. So the relation between this capacity, the way of conduct, and the consequence of individual deeds are crucial. Medieval sources, in fact, supply plenty of evidence that Japanese Buddhists believed that it was man's right or wrong conduct under the laws of moral causation that determined their own destiny, as well as the circumstances in which Buddhism existed. The notion of moral causation may be considered from two different temporal angles. We can look at it we can look at the present situation as result from deeds in the past. At the same time, however, we also need to look at what is done in the present, at the appropriate conduct in the present in view of a future situation. So the first angle, the first perspective, is related to the notion that people benefit from the good deeds and virtues accumulated in a former life, it's called shukuda, and are damaged by the inferior rewards of capacity as a result of deluded actions in a previous existence. Because the medieval period is that of the final dharma, and in that age, people no longer have we can say the karma for enlightenment at their disposal, only the karma to practice the teachings left. So in general, Buddhism attributes one's present suffering to one's past actions or causes that remain in one's life, and asserts that one must suffer the effect of every negative cause made in the past. However, medieval sources emphasize a different possibility, a principle of lessening one's retribution, whereby by practicing Buddhism and accumulating its benefits, one can diminish the effect of karma, both in terms of time and intensity. In one of his letters to his followers, that is often known as lessening one's karmic retribution, it's just that different titles, this letter. Nichiren writes, if one's heavy karma from the past is not expiated within this lifetime, one must undergo the sufferings of hell in the future. But if one experiences extreme hardship in this life because of the Lotus Sutra, if he practices this teachings of the Lotus Sutra that he advocated, the sufferings of hell will vanish instantly. And when one dies, one will obtain the blessing of the human and heavenly world, as well as those of the three vehicles and the one vehicle of the entirety of the attainments of the Buddhas. Other writers resonate with Nichiren. For instance, again, Moevs claimed that the particular type of faith that he advocated could save the believers from the suffering of hell and allow them to be reborn in the Sushita heaven, another paradise, the paradise of Buddha Maitreya. So these writers are not just doing, are not going with their own interpretation, but again draw from sutras, from other scriptures that underpin these notions. For instance, Nichiren uses the Nirvana Sutra, another scripture that states that by protecting the Buddhist Dharma, the Buddhist law, one obtains blessings that allow one to diminish one's retribution in this lifetime. So we can say that emphasis here is placed on human responsibility rather than the inevitability of the cyclical process. If one realizes the cause of the decay, then one has the possibility to halt the generation. In this sense, capacity means understanding, and its dimensions are historical. The development of these themes gives a millenaristic dimension to Buddhist eschatology. The final age is posited as unavoidable, but also as is necessary because it is an indispensable condition to start a new era. It is in this way that I think thinking about time, past, present, and future acquires a soteriological function. In fact, in writers such as Nichiren, we can detect tropes that are recurrent in European medieval millennialism. We see the perception of the catastrophe that affects not only religious dharma, but also the life of the country, and the link to political situation here is very important. There's the idea of a second propagation of Buddhism, we can say, because it is often advocated that the new form of practice that one of the other writers wants to put forward is a new coming of Buddhas, of the Buddha, so to speak. And there is also the certainty of being the one who has understood in so Nichiren says that of himself, Heisei says the same of himself, and so on. And finally, there is a diachronic view of history, which stresses the need to adapt the principle of history, that some writers call doris, this underlying principle that guides the human action and the unfolding of history, of adapting it to the present circumstances. So this adaptation to present circumstances is a very important concept in medieval Buddhism, certainly. The link created between Buddhism and contemporary politics is particularly important in the 13th century, where several writers who were themselves involved in politics, and I mentioned earlier on Jian, in fact spoke of the rectification of the country, if I can call it like that, as equal to salvation, to liberation. And this is perhaps another term of comparison with Dante, especially if we think of the interest that Dante had in local and national, maybe we can even say international politics. My school time memory remind me of the sixth canto of the Commedia, which in each of the parts in Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso addresses the political situation of a ever-growing entity. In Inferno is Florence, in Purgatorio is Italy, and then when we by the time we get to Paradiso, Dante turns to the emperor and asks the rulers to intervene to change the fortunes of the country. It's very interesting how much discussion of good government is in 13th century Japanese Buddhist writers. For Jian, it's a question of, it's a matter of family fortunes, we could say, but also Nichiren extensively speaks of the role that rulers have at this specific moment in time to act in order not to destroy both Buddhism and the nations, if I can, and their own countries would be my way of saying. For instance, one passage that it's reiterated in different wordings across the corpus of Nichiren says, and I'm quoting, if the king wants to maintain peace in his country, he should question and search for the cause of the present situation and not listen to those who slander the law. And elsewhere, he clearly says, Nichiren clearly says that attention to the political situation is necessary because without a country or without a people, faith in the Buddha cannot explicate itself. So the link between time, positive millenarian time, and prophecy, and this way of looking at the future, prophetic looking at the possibility of the futures, transform the end of the time as the perfect time for salvation, and transform the place where these religious rites, so Japan, as the perfect place, almost you could say the chosen place, chosen nation, where this positive view of history unfolds. So Japan becomes the place where the negativity implied in the notions of decline of the Dharma can be transformed into a sort of utopic perfection, and is the place from which Buddhism starts a new successful development. So in other words, Japan becomes crucial for the survival of Buddhism in its entire world. And because of this emphasis on knowing and on understanding, there is emphasis also on the Buddhist teachers who is the one who understands, who carries out the propagation of Buddhism. So in other words, these connections of thinking about time and about the future time means also to think of the Buddhist teacher, of Nichiren in this case, as the person on whom the future of religion and politics alike depends. In fact, Nichiren wrote in many works that he was the one who could guide Japan towards its renovation because he was the one who had understood the message of the Buddha. And I'm quoting here, it says, Nichiren as the pillar and the beam of Japan, the destiny of Japan depended him. And from Japan, Buddhism, because of Nichiren and because of his act, Buddhism will not only survive, but flourish. I have previously compared this aspect of Nichiren with the 15th century Italian monk Girolamo Savonarola, who explained contemporary political events in the light of the decline of Christian faith and identified the destiny of his city, Florence, with the adoption of the correct form of Christianity, and also proclaimed that this city would become the center of a new Christendom that would spread to the entire world. So there are, I think, some parallels, very close parallels between this, what's been called the civics millenarianism of Savonarola in the sermons that he delivered in Florence. I've also been struck by the similarity of language with Nichiren. For instance, in a passage of the Prediche Italiane Fiorentini, where Savonarola says, "You Florence will be the reformation of all Italy. From there, the renewal would start and spread over because this is the navel of Italy." And I'm quoting. I'm not sure how much time I have.
We're about at 10:35 time, but you can take, okay. We have a little bit of time built in, so you can take your time to wrap up.
Maybe I'll just mention something about prophecy and then wrap up just very, very briefly. There is also, obviously, in all these elaboration, articulation of the final time, and there is a prophetic flavor. And medieval Japan was also a time in which many prophecies were written. They were composed by various figures. They were discovered. They were independent documents, or sometimes poems, sometimes engraved in stones, or parts of larger compositions. So this is an aspect of Japanese production that's hardly been looked at, but it's very interesting to connect it to the eschatological dimension of the time. These prophecies rested on the belief in the reciprocal support between religious and secular authority, what is known in Japan, the law of the Buddha and the law of the king. And it is within this context that people like Yosai Nichiren could proclaim that the spreading of their own type of Buddhism, whether it's Zen or whether it's Lotus Sutra, has effects that are not only spiritual, that not concerning only the individual, but bring welfare and peace to the country. And maybe I'll stop that and we can talk about it in the future. So let me conclude. There is no doubt that concerns with the end of time dominated medieval Japan and enhanced the sense of living in a moment of struggle and suffering. In the notion of the final age, in fact, individual social and political anxieties converged. We may perhaps think that the eschatology of the final age was just a rhetorical device. The framework of the discussion of the end remained karmic retribution, a law of nature that triggered the dissolution of Buddhism and end of human beings. The scriptures spoke of cosmic calamities, large ones, fire, water, and wind, or historical calamities, pestilence, and famine. However, the Japanese interpreters did not stay there to contemplate their own powerlessness. They looked beyond the end and connected the karmic destructions to wrong deeds in one's life and wrong conduct in the country. That allowed them to refocus the end on this world, the present world, the present time of the individual who lived at a specific place and at in a specific century. So we can see here perhaps a form of engaged Buddhism that sees in the specific history of medieval Japan, both the space in which social action unfolds and the space that produces salvation. So the interpretation of the time of history then becomes the form that the religious message of the Buddhists we've talked about assumes, and the point made here is that to know the time is to know the truth. In fact, finish here with another passage from a work by Nichiren that is called discussion on the time, on selecting the time. He says, and I'm quoting, the non-Buddhist texts say that he is called the sage who understands the science of the future. But Buddhist texts say that the sage is one who knows the three worlds, that is the past, present, and future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lucia, for a really stimulating talk. I feel like I might use my moderator privileges to ask a question later. Perhaps I thought we'd just take a very quick break right now for maybe 5 minutes and come back at, well, let's say 7 minutes and come back at 10:50 at LA time, if that's okay. And then I will introduce Andrew Hui and we'll proceed with the conference. So I'll see you all in 7 minutes.
Thank you.
Welcome back, everybody. Welcome back, everyone. Our next speaker is Andrew Hui, who teaches at Yale University-NUS College, Singapore. And he's the author of the Poetics of Ruins in Renaissance Literature, and also of A Theory of the Aphorism from Confucius to Twitter, which at Spanish translation has just appeared, and he has forthcoming translations of that in Chinese, Greek, and Turkish. I'd also imagine, I can imagine a Japanese translation of this very, very, very easily. It's the kind of thing that would go well in Japan. He also has an article appearing next spring in Critical Inquiry entitled Dreams of the Universal Library, and that sort of provides a preview of his current project. Today, he's going to talk about Dante's Vegetables and the philosophy of plant life in the Divine Comedy. So without further ado.
Great, thank you, TORQUIL. Okay, I'm going to do share screen. All right, and can everybody hear me and see me? Okay, all right, here we go. Well, thank you so much to the host for inviting me to this conference. I'm neither a Dantista nor Buddhologist, but so I hope I'll have something interesting to say about one or the other, and I hope I won't bring shame to my institutional identity or all my other identities. So, okay, my talk is entitled Dante's Vegetables, the Philosophy of Plant Life in the Divine Comedy, and it goes something like this. Readers of Dante's Divine Comedy, which I'm sure are many or all of you, will remember the beautiful lines that conclude the Purgatorio. Io ritornai dalla santissima onda, rifattosi come pianta novella, rivelate di novella fronda, puro disposto a salire alle stelle. I return from the most holy wave, refreshed as new plants are renewed with new leaves, pure and ready to rise to the stars. Now, the commentary tradition, some 700 years from the time of Dante's sons Jacopo to our present day, has focused on the repetition of le stelle that concludes each canticle. In the Inferno, as you undoubtedly will call, Dante and Virgil admire with uplifted eyes the stars' fiery beauty. E quindi uscimmo a riverde le stelle, and hence we came forth to look again at the stars. In Paradiso, from the vantage point of the Empyrean, the pilgrim looks down to the sphere of the fixed stars. L'amor che muove stole altre stelle. By the love that moves the sun and other stars. In the Purgatorio, by contrast, Dante is obviously in the middle, newly cleansed between heaven and earth, poised to ascend to the celestial spheres. But perhaps these dazzling stars have shone so brightly that they've eclipsed the equally arresting image of him as a lowly green shoot. Rifattosi come piante novella, rivelate di novella fronda. Now, this image of a plant flourishing with fresh fronda, the Italian here denotes both branches and leaves, is what I want to think about, what I want to share with you today. And it's going to be my micro aperture to think about the larger imagery of plants and ecology in Dante and how it might be in dialogue with Buddhist thoughts on plants and vegetations. Dante, in short, is succulent. The image of the poet as a plant is at once commonplace and strange. Commonplace because such metaphors of ecology are the basic motifs of literature, ancient and modern, north, south, east, and west. So it's global, and at the same time, strange because of the directionality of the image, which it is juxtaposed, whereas the appearance of the stars causes Dante to rise to the heavens. Salir, the plant by its nature is rooted and descends down to the earth. So to take the simile at its word, Dante's metaphysical ascent to celestial spheres is powered by the mineral nutrients of the soil. So the basic image of poetry, its elemental materia, the green soil, the green ecology, or the brown soil, the green ecology of the natural world, cannot be stated any clearly than in the final lines of the Purgatorio. Dante, again, uses the lowly, earthly, terrestrial plants to imagine new worlds and envision the state of his soul, now ready to embark on the final voyage that is transcendental, metaphysical, celestial, and perhaps ultimately one that is non-dual, as Vittorio Montemaggi and Christian Moevs claim. So my talk can only give the most skeletal outlines of the ecology of Dante's great poem. But with the time that I have, I want to claim that Dante's ecology is nourished by three roots. One, by the philosophical ideas of plant life that is derived from ancient philosophy of Plato and Aristotle. Second, the poetics of plant imageries that are derived from the epic tradition from Homer, Virgil to Ovid. And third, the theology of ecology found in scripture. So in order to excavate Dante's philosophy of plant life, one must look at Plato's and Aristotle's theory of biology, Number two, the treatment of people as plants, especially in similes in the tradition of epic poetry. And number three, the scriptural images of cultivation and dissemination. And for the purpose of this conference, one might want to think about the resonances and dissonances between perspectives on the environment from Buddhism and Dante, and what they think the relationship between sentient beings and the space that they inhabit are. And beyond pointing out the obvious relationship between plants and humans, I want to tease out a more intimate kinship between them, one that goes beyond a striking poetic simile or a strictly biological analogy. Indeed, the last lines of Purgatorio underscores that a significant part of ourselves, i.e. our souls, are also plants. So if the Inferno is concerned with the correction of the will, the Paradiso charts its perfection, Purgatorio is equally concerned with the lower, more fundamental, that is to say, the nutritive. And here I'm thinking of Aristotle's tripartite model of the soul, the basis being the vegetative, which is our faculty for nutrition, breathing, growing, and senescence. Animal, which is our appetitive, locomotive faculties, and the highest faculty, which is the intellectual, the rational, and the spiritual. Through the pervasive analogies, metaphors, and images of plant and vegetative life in the poem, Dante, I want to argue, constructs a purgatory in which there's a rectification of not only the appetitive and intellectual part of the soul, but equally important, a cleansing of the vegetative soul, the vital, non-cognitive, non-discursive part, which we share in common with all things, all living things, that is, all organic or all organisms. So in other words, Dante and much of medieval biology of the soul posit that the fundamental part of the human is based and rooted in our vegetative faculties. If current eco-criticism has asked us to rethink the human, Dante and the philosophical tradition that he absorbs insists that the non-human life is embedded within, that is to say, it is at the root of the human. In short, Dante fuses the science of the soul with the theology of plants, and by doing so, he crafts a sublime poetry of nature that goes beyond nature. And thus his poetry is able to express a profound spiritual and biological truth. The rejuvenation of the human is not analogous, but indeed homologous to plant life. What I mean by that is that plant and human growth is metonymic and not just metaphoric. Now, one of the most important questions in East Asian Buddhism is the scope and range of Buddha nature, namely whether it is in all things or not. Can plants and other things in nature, even stones, become Buddhas? How do vegetables fit in the complex economy and ecology of Shobo, karmic retribution? Now, Fabio Rambelli, one of our participants, has done much work on this, and I'm very glad that he's participating here. In an early work, Vegetal Buddhas, he uses three terms: Ekosophia, the Buddhist doctrine of denying non-sentience, the possibility of Buddha nature; Ekognosis, the Tendai and Shingon initiatory doctrines on the absolute and unconditioned nature of non-sentience; and finally, Ekopietas, the popular widespread beliefs about the sacredness of nature and things in general. So now that we're fortunate enough to have Fabio Rambelli here, we can ask how we might put these into conversations with Dante. Okay, so when we take in the vast expanse of the Divine Comedy, we're reminded that its architecture is built on a verdant green topology. The entire arc of text is formed by the arboreal. The protagonist's journey commences in the Selva Selvaggia, and in the geographic middle is the Divina Foresta of Eden, and finally the image of the celestial rose crowns Paradiso. The poem's verses are filled with descriptions and comparisons of foglie, rami, arbre, semi, frutti, radice, fioretti, pomme, fronde. And one of the first autobiographical similes of Dante is when he's describing himself as a flower opening to the rays of the sunlight, perhaps as a nod to the fioretti of St. Francis. Quali fioretti dal notturno gello, chi nati e chiusi, poiché soli in bianca. As little flowers bowed and close in the chill of night, when the sun whitens and straightens up all the open stems. In Inferno 13, the circle of the suicides is located in the harsh woods where there's no green leaves, non fronde verde. And there's this repetition of non, right? This space of pure negation. At the end of Purgatorio 1, Virgil wipes the brow of Dante with an instantaneous generating plant, umile pianta, and green growth is always used as an index for the transience of life, fame. The crowning green of glory lasts but a short while, says Purgatorio 11. In the culmination of Purgatorio, the Edenic tree of the knowledge of good and evil is renewed by the coming of Christ. Of course, the wooden cross that redeems the Edenic tree. And a few lines later, Beatrice is seated at this root of this fronda nova. So encompassing self and society, politics and family, genealogy and the institution of the church, plant imageries partake in the great life cycle of the temporal world, germination and growth, flourishing and dehiscence, blossoming and fruition, senescence and decay. Plants then seem to have something to do with the deformation and reformation of human nature itself. Vegetation promises perennial renewal, fecundity, life itself. And the return of the seasons mark cyclical and linear time. And the Christian sacraments, after all, are composed materially of olive oil, wheat, grape, and water. And the chronological doctrine, the Christological doctrine is founded on the substance and symbolism of the wooden cross as a material and metaphysical thing that brings resurrection of life from dead. Christ on the dead tree becomes the vector of history, propelling humankind towards a new earth, a new heaven. And though the earthly paradise of Eden is a perfect seminary of plant life, it is remarkable that even in the rarefied spheres of Paradiso, Dante still uses such botanical imagery to describe the state of the blessed life. Now, let me give you a florilegia of examples. In Paradiso 26, Dante proclaims that le fronde onde s'infronda tutto l'orto, de ortolano eterno, io cotanto quando da lui allor di bene apporto. The leaves wherewith all the orchard of the eternal gardener flourishes, do I love in the measure of the goodness that is conveyed from him to them. When St. John questions Dante, he responds, I love the leaves with which the garden of the eternal gardener is in leaf with the measure of the good he has bestowed on him. Oh, sorry, this is the same thing. Okay. Thomas Aquinas describes the two circles of 12 philosophers as 24 plants, 24 piante. In Paradiso 24, Dante praises Peter as, for you came into the field poor and hungry to sow the good plant, formerly a vine, but now becoming a thorn bush. Beatrice in Paradiso 23 tells Dante that the saints are a fair garden which blossoms beneath the rays of Christ. And as he's about to talk to Adam, Dante describes himself as a pianta, bending to the wind of Beatrice's words. The Empyrean itself is an enormous rose to whose petals the angels fly like a swarm of fertilizing bees. In each folia, the souls of the blessed reside in perpetual joy. This is Paradiso 31. And the paradox in describing paradise as a garden is that the temporal is made atemporal. For in paradise, everything is suspended in its right perfection under the perpetuum of eternity, since there is no light and darkness, thus beyond time and space. So the rest of the paper, what I want to do is trace the trajectory of plant life in the poem in three important moments. First, in the circle of suicides in Inferno 13, the formation of Ombra in Purgatorio 25, and finally Dante's conversation with Adam in Paradiso 26. Okay, so Inferno 13. As Aristotle in De Anima expostulates, now this term to live has more than one sense, and provided any one alone of these is found in a thing, we say that a thing is living, viz. Thinking, sensation, local movement and rest, or movement in the sense of nutrition, decay, and growth. Hence, we think of a species of plants also as living, for they are observed to possess in themselves a principle and potentiality through which they grow and decay in opposite directions. By nutritive powers, he says, we mean that part of the soul which is common also to plants. Now, in the circle of suicides, my reading of it is that Dante takes the Aristotelian tradition of plant life as the basic force of life and overturns it through the spirit of contrapasso in the Infernum to its most basis and basic sense. Because what happens in the circle of suicide is that there's a degeneration into the lowest rung of biological life for the sinners who are punished there. Piero delle Vigne, of course, is turned into a plant. In other words, because Pierre delle Vigne, and note the mineral and vegetative significance of his names, Pierre, rock, and Vigne, vine, he's abdicated the highest part of his soul, the rational, because he's killed himself after all, and so he's reduced to its lowest, the vegetative. Yet Dante's poetics differs from Aristotle in this way. Peter is still sentient and rational. His punishment is to feel the pain from the harpy's ferocious bites and to endure the sorrow of non-self-determination. This is precisely what makes Pierre so pathetic and charismatic. He possesses his full intelligence, and he speaks in the well-crafted modulations of courtly rhetoric, and yet he's denied a body. Now, in his reformulation of Foucauldian biopolitics and sovereign power, Giorgio Agamben meditates on this, what he calls the intimate caesura between the division of life into the vegetal and animal into the human. And he says this in The Open, Man and Animal. Because Peter has been stripped of his bios, political life, and he takes his own zoe, bare life, only to be punished eternal living in the abjected vegetative state in hell. Dante's hell, we might say in the lexicon of Agamben, it's the pure, absolute, and impassable biopolitical space. In life, Peter is marked by two fatal caesura. He's first cut off from Frederick, and second, he cuts himself off from his own existence. So in death, Peter is marked by this recursive caesura that never heals. Dante plucks him, the harpies plucks him, and so on it goes. So in this episode of the suicide, Dante reveals to us simply that of plant life in its most miserable state. Okay, now Purgatorio 25, the formation of our vegetative soul. Now, it is in Purgatorio 25 that Dante discourses most fully on the formation of the parts of our souls, the vegetative, the animal, and the intellectual. The Roman poet Statius speaks on the formation of the aerial body. Anima fatta la virtute attiva, qual una pianta intanto differente, che questa è in via, quella è già arriva. This active power, having become a soul like that of a plant, but different insofar as it is still underway, while the other is already in port. The vegetative soul here acquires first sensitive faculties and then rational powers. Now, Bruno Nardi, more than a century ago, already argued that this process articulated by Statius differs substantially from Aquinas' theory of the discontinuous process in which the new form of the soul replaces the old one, which passes away when the new one intervenes. And as Emanuele Granolati argues in Experiencing the Afterlife, he says, Aquinas states that the rational soul is created as already having vegetative, sensitive faculties, and that the sensitive soul passes away with the creation of the rational soul. Statius, on the contrary, says that the rational soul absorbs the sensitive soul and into its substances. What this means is that the vegetative soul acquires first sensitive faculties, and only afterwards, with the direct intervention of God, rational powers. But Statius here says that the rational soul created by God is the active and surviving agent, which absorbs in its substance the sensitive soul, thus acquiring vegetative and sensitive powers. So the separated soul carries with it both what is human, the formative virtue, and the vegetative sensitive powers, what is divine, the intellectual ones created by God. So when it is infused in the body, the vegetative sensitive soul does not pass away completely because it is drawn up by the rational soul into its substance, so that the result is an alma sola, right? A single soul that is entirely incorruptible. As such, the vegetative soul is fully and continuous part of the human being. Thus, as Dante's intellectual and appetitive parts are cleansed and reformed in Purgatorio, so must the vegetative part necessarily be cleansed and reformed too. Okay, now we move on to Paradiso, and I'm interested in Canto 26, in which there is a curious autosimile in which Dante is saying, come la fronda che flette la cima nel transito del vento e poi si leva per la propria virtù che la subia fec'io intanto in quella diceva stupendo e poi mi rifece sicuro un diseo che parlare ondio ardeva. As the tree bends its highest branches in a gust of wind and springs back, raised up by natural inclination, so was I overcome when she was speaking, awestruck. This is Beatrice, and then restored to confidence by the words that burned in me to express. And here he addresses Adam as, "O fruit who alone were brought forth ripe." Note here that Dante is the fronda that addresses the pommo. So Dante is the fronda and Adam is the pommo. In a way, he's reversing the cause and effect. And so it's kind of a chicken or egg problem, right? Did the pommo come first or the fronda? Shouldn't Dante be the fruit and Adam the tree, or is it the other way around? In any case, the simile here is appropriate because the motion of the fronda, right? It's bending and lifting. It imitates the motion of falling and rising. And because now that Dante is puro and disposto, he has the strength and will not be toppled. Thus, the force of the simile comes first in its flexibility, and second, it prepares us for the more arboreal imagery. Dante is described as "o pommo che maturo solo prodotti fosti." So of all the epithets that Dante could have accorded to the first man, I want to ask, why is Dante addressed as a fruit? Interestingly, when Adam speaks, he does not use the acts of tasting the fruit, but rather legno. He says he substitutes legno for pommo. And so this recalls the legno in Purgatorio 24. It says it's the wood or the tree that was bitten by Eve, right? Che fu morso da Eva. So the imagery here, I want to say, distinctly recalls the celebrated simile of Inferno 3, when Dante limns the genealogy of the epic tradition par excellence through the quintessential vegetative elements of leaves and seeds. And this is as in the autumn, the leaves came, so the evil seeds of Adam, right, threw themselves, right, from one side to the other, right? So this is perhaps one of the most famous topoi in the classical tradition, one that ties together Aeneid and the Georgics and unbeknownst to Dante, the Iliad, right? And so what Dante is doing here is that he's using the falling leaves to mark the end of life in the cycle of seasons, both the unidirectionality of human souls, but also the recurring rhythms of the natural world. Okay, so let's see where this rhyme zone leads us. Men are called Umal Semme d'Adamo in Inferno, and the genealogy of princes is described as a family tree with branches in Purgatorio 7. And Virgil in a canto in Purgatorio 26, what he says is that for mortal custom is like a leaf upon a branch which goes and then another comes. And in Inferno 33, Frate Dorigo describes himself as "I son qual de la fruta del malordo," and similarly, Ugo Capet describes himself as "Io fu radice de la malapianta." This is Purgatorio 20. What Dante adumbrates in this rhyme zone cluster, as it were, is salvation history through the ecology of plants. Our destiny is shaped by vegetables. Gardens begin and end history. Genesis 2:3, Revelations 2. The tree of our first parents, we're plunged from the temporality of nature into the contingencies of history. And in the providential theology of the New Testament, Christ is the vine that redeems the corrupted seed of Adam. And the Gospels are replete with images of us as seeds, vines, and trees. In the Gospel of Luke, the angel at the scene of the Annunciation praises Mary and the fruit of thy womb, right? He that soweth the good seed is the Son of Man, and the field is the word, and the good seed are the children of the kingdom, Matthew 13. With the cross of the tree, the antitype of the Eden tree, were redeemed from the wages of sin and led towards eternal life. Paul describes the work of evangelization as one of planting and cultivation. And similar to Jesus' parable of the sower, Paul also says, senseless man, that which thou sowest is not quickened except it dies first, and that which thou sowest not the body, that shall be but bare grain as of wheat. This is 1 Corinthians 15. Okay, so let me conclude now. Today, plant theory is one of the most vibrant and verdant fields in the humanities. The development of eco-criticism has brought a fundamental rethinking about the ethical relationship between human beings and their non-human others. In our age of climate change, we in the humanities first responded by thinking about the environment at large, then animal studies was all the rage, and now lately we've been thinking about plants. And scholars have posited that plant thinking is the non-cognitive, non-ideational, and the non-imagistic mode of thinking that is beyond or below the reach of the human intellect. As Michael Martyr has pointed out in his book, The Philosopher's Plant, philosophers have long used plants to think. For example, Augustine's pears, Avicenna's celery, Maimonides' palm trees, Leibniz's blade of grass, Kant's tulip, Hegel's grapes, Heidegger's apple trees, Derrida's sunflowers, Irigawi's water lily, and so forth. And the metaphor of the root, as Christy Wampel has discovered, turns out to be central to 20th century European thinking. And because plants constitute the bulk of our visible biomass and underpin all natural ecosystems, for Matthew Hall, they should be considered other than human persons. And for Jeffrey Nealon, plants rather than animals should therefore be the starting point for all critiques of humanist biopower. So I want to challenge and perhaps enrich this burgeoning conversation. In their enthusiasm to create an alternative account of living things, theorists such as Martyr and Hall characterize the philosophical tradition's blindness in their attention to plants. The problem with their account of history of philosophy is that they view Plato's and Aristotle's paradigms, the vegetal soul representing botanical life that is placed at the bottom of the heap with humans at the apex, they view it rather negatively, right? Now, there is another way to see it, is that the ancient philosophers viewed that the bottom should not be taken pejorative at all, but more in the salutary sense of the fundamental, basic, and necessary. On the other hand, though the status of plants in certain spheres of philosophical inquiry might have been denigrated, poets have been long thinking about and valuing plants from the time of Homer and before. It is incontestable that Dante is a thinker of the soil, of habit, of ecology. What's more, Dante shows that plant life is not metaphoric, but metonymic to our human life, not only complementary, but constitutive to our biology. So the contribution to this essay to plant theory is to show that Dante was deeply vested in thinking about all biological life. And the contribution to Dante studies is to show how the Divine's Comedy's rich networks of plants, trees, seeds, flowers, and gardens have so far been understudied by scholars. Finally, I want to bring this talk directly to the topic at hand, Dante and Buddhism, through engaging with Rambelli's work on vegetal Buddhism. Now, one of the central questions he states in his work is, again, whether in Buddhism, whether all things have Buddha nature, in particular plants. Now, in Christianity, there's no question whether plants ought to be saved since they're not marked by sin. And so their state was never fallen, therefore they don't need to be redeemed. In fact, as the final imagery of Paradiso suggests, the stages of salvation makes it seem that humans should become more like plants by cleansing the impure part of our animality, intellectuality, and spirituality. And since we know that plants feel, then does it follow that they suffer? And what volitions and what skillful means are at the disposal to alleviate such suffering? Now, poets and thinkers everywhere will agree that plants and people share the same life phases: birth, stability, alteration, death. And no one can escape the cycle of the seasons: spring, summer, fall, winter, at least in the northern and southern hemisphere. In tropical Singapore, there are really no seasons, but in any case. So how do plants fit in this sociological arc of salvation, desire for enlightenment, its practice, and its attainment in nirvana or salvation? Now, in Buddhist materiality, Rambelli discusses how trees constitute the arena of contested relations between the sacred and the profane, the human social world and the realms of deities, in particular the dynamics between Buddhism and local cults. Trees are not just a symbol of nature and the sacred, he writes, but also a natural resource whose exploitation was often contested among various groups. And so we might want to think about how nature is built in both the cosmologies, ontologies, and soteriologies of Christianity and Buddhism. And we must also be cautious, as Rambelli reminds us, of this false dichotomy that somehow Eastern beliefs revere nature more, whereas the West exploits it. For in fact, environmental damage is as bad in the East as it is in the West, whether in antiquity or modernity. So after all, what then is the intersection of materiality and spirituality in these two belief systems? For Dante and Buddhism, trees and plants are the receptacles of both the visible and invisible world. Forests represent the realm of primeval chaos and uncontrolled powers. And in his study of Forrest, Robert Poe Harrison, calls them nothing less but the shadow of civilization. So let me end with this direct comparison with Psalm 95 and something from Togan on, which Rambelli cites. This is what the Psalm says. Let the heavens rejoice and let the earth be glad. Let the seas be moved and the fullness thereof. The fields and all things that are in them shall be joyful. Then shall all the trees of the woods rejoice. And this is from Togan An. Plants and land, mountains, rivers, and swamp, the earth and the sky. There is no place where the manifestations of traces of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas does not occur. Okay, this is my talk. Thanks.
Thank you, Andrew, for a really fascinating talk. Our final presenter, well, our discussant is Diego Locota, who teaches in our Department of Asian Languages and Cultures here at UCLA. He specializes in the spread of Buddhism along the Silk Road during the first millennium CE in the cultural areas of South, Central, and East Asia. He works with texts in the main scriptural languages of Buddhism, which means Sanskrit, Pali, Chinese, and Tibetan, as well as also the much rarer Gandhari and Khotanese. And his recent research features philological treatment of unpublished and undeciphered manuscript fragments from Central Asia, but constantly in dialogue with art history, archaeology, and modern ethnography. So Diego, whenever you're ready.
Well, thank you for the introduction, TORQUIL. And well, I have to say in the first place that I'm very excited to be here, very excited to see the new direction of the CMRS, now CMRS Center for Early Global Studies. This idea of considering, moving beyond Europe and putting Europe in dialogue with the rest of the world. So here I have to start with a couple of disclaimers. The first is that I am a historian by training, a philologist, and a historian is how I would define myself. So like myself, getting into the muddy waters of philosophy is an act of hubris. It's probably like a very naive approach, but I look forward to hearing what you may have to say. And my experience of Dante, I did my first degree in Bologna, and courses like classes in Italian literature were mandatory. So my exposure is limited, but it's there. It's part of my past, and Bologna is also very significant for Dante. So. Let's start with Vittorio's paper. The first point that I would like to say that I personally very much appreciated, very much enjoyed, was complicating the notion of the commedia as this perfect masterpiece. Right? Of course, it's the Italian national epic, is the first work written in what would eventually become Italian, right? And so that freezes it in this like kind of pedestal of perfection, when recently some voices within Italy itself have pointed out the fact that many points of the commedia read through the lens of our modern sensibility and our modern ethics do appear openly homophobic, Islamophobic, anti-Semitic, racist, etc. So that's something that I wanted to highlight. Now, on a paper dealing mostly with like Western systems of theology, I feel that my something I could do here would be providing some sort of counterpoint, again, committing an act of hubris and trying to imagine what could be Buddhist responses to these postulates. So what I see firstly is, like what does strike you from the point of view of Buddhism is like a very strong difference in vocabulary and in premises. So in terms, non-duality, we have to say, within Buddhism is an emic concept, right? Within the languages of Buddhism, you speak openly about non-duality, it's not implicit. You speak about non-duality. That, however, doesn't mean that it has a specific definition. It's very fuzzy. So, you know, like a central tension in Buddhism is between the realm of enlightenment, which is in material, is preterconceptual, it's absolute, but it's mostly apophatic in the sense that it's mostly defined by exclusion, right? It's nothing like we know, it's something else, but we won't tell you what it is, right? As opposed to the tangible material realm of samsara, of like the cycle of rebirth and the tangible world that we inhabit. But within that, so that being the dichotomy or the duality, right? The tradition itself has undermined the contrast by proposing several systems of merging that gap or that distance, right? So since famously, for example, Buddhism denies the existence of the individual or the self, right? The subject-object dichotomy vanishes. Of course, then, you know, of course, any discussion of particularity or individuality or the place as individual like becomes irrelevant because it's an illusion, right? And here, of course, you know, like within this framework, of course, like in mainstream Buddhist doctrine, pride and humility are very central, precisely because one would be like the emphasizing this illusion of the self, while the other would open something similar to what Vittorio points out, this openness to experience and to uncertainty, right? However, there's also, for example, in Yogacara doctrine, the objective or external world is understood as also as a product of the mind. So there's this only like the mind, and there's no real external world. Then conventional conceptual reality in Madhyamaka theory, for example, is just simply an illusion that covers the ultimate reality, which is the void in this case, right? And of course, this epistemological nihilism of Madhyamaka also blurs the distinction between enlightenment and reincarnation. Also, and different doctrine that also blurs those boundaries is the Tathagata Garbhan doctrine, like the doctrine of the, potential for enlightenment of the entire sentient universe. Another point of contrast here, you know, like Vittorio talked about the last portion of the last canto of the Commedia in which Dante experiences God, right? And the attributes are also very indifferent, right? Like the Dantean God is alive, vivo lume. He is love, right? Te ami is amore, etc. Right? All these things sound very, very, from Buddhist perspective, sound very puzzling, because that ultimate reality is ultimately ineffable, and if anything, attributes like love or even intellect are understood to be mirages of human perception. You know, even for example, form, right? Form as a manifestation of divinity, helomorphism. Form is understood in mainstream Buddhist scholastic doctrine as a hindrance, right? As like this built-in kind of impediment that we have to perceiving that ultimate ineffable preterconceptual reality. Likewise for creator and creation. Famously, that is one of the undisclosed questions, one of the points that the Buddha was repeatedly asked about, and he refused to answer. You know, he didn't think it was a question worth engaging in. So famously, as per the words imputed to the Buddha, the world is that we perceive has no discernible beginning or end, right? So there's no point of creation or creature. etc. So, you know, all I will say here is that it's remarkable how from like this Dantean mystical experience and from what is a much wider set of doctrinal premises in Buddhism, we're reaching a similar point, but really from entirely different premises. Now, as for Lucia's paper, I will, you know, comment on odds and ends here that I found interesting. Poetry as religious experience. Famously, the Buddha is said to have disliked poetry and constantly, like the oldest stratum of Buddhist texts, constantly contrasts words that are beautiful but false, the words of poetry, and words that are kind of like ugly or stern or bare but true, which are the utterances of the Buddha, which are like ultimately, yeah, kind of ugly but true. Now, of course, this, well, famously, of course, I guess the Dante specialist here, like, you know, everyone must be aware of this, Miguel Asín Palacios' theory of like Muslim influence on Dante's narrative, right? And so like, but in fact, the visit of hells and heavens, so to speak, yeah, it's really a true literary genre within Buddhism. From India all the way to the Japanese instances that Lucia mentioned. In India, there's the Pali Panchagati Dipani, the visitation of the 5 realms of rebirth. Then very rich literature in China too, right? Maudgalyayana and Kshitigarbha visiting their mothers in hell and seeing all of that. Which makes me think that this obsession, of course, say typologically, like the idea that after death, you're rewarded or punished and you go to different places according to that is fairly widespread. Yet this obsession with like this very, very specific taxonomies and geographies of hell and of heaven, it seemed to me more characteristic of religions that have aimed at a universal ethic, as say Islam, Christianity, or Buddhism, right? Hindus, for example, don't seem to have engaged much in like, you know, speculation on how hell was built. Another very interesting point of contact, this Dantean notion of contrapasso, that the punishment should resemble in some way the offense or the sin. That is very Buddhist, you know, like and it's perplexing because, so in Avadana literature, in this genre of literature that explores how deeds meet this cosmic requital, and so, you know, if you do something good in a next life, you're going to receive some reward. From the doctrinal point of view, from the point of view of scholastic philosophy, this has an ethical dimension, right? You did something and then you got to get something that is unpleasurable, unpleasant, or bad, etc. Right? There should be no reason why your punishment has to resemble what you did. And yet, in this more popular form of literature that is all over the place, if you, I don't know, if you called someone a dog in this life, then in the next one you're going to be reborn as a dog, etc. And finally, I found extremely fascinating the notion of Nichiren and Dante as both political thinkers in a time of crisis, a time of crisis as a call for a time for, as a call for political action. And now finally moving to Andrew's paper. So, you know, I think that Fabio Rambelli, as the author of a book on plants in East Asian Buddhism, should be the more proper respondent to discussant for this paper, but so therefore I will be rather circumspect. For those who are not aware of the book, Fabio Rambelli's Vegetal Buddhas discusses specifically the problem of of the place of plants in the grand picture of enlightenment and the cosmos, reaching the conclusion that mostly, and then here Fabio, you can correct me if that's a misperception, it's only in Japan really where like the problem of whether plants are enlightened or can potentially be enlightened really becomes a thing. Like in China, not much. And therefore, I would like to pair Fabio's book with a companion piece, which is Lambert Schmidhausen's The Problem of the Sentience of Plants in Earliest Buddhism, which examines the Indian tradition. And the conclusions of Schmidhausen are really interesting. So while this earliest Indian Buddhist tradition does acknowledge say a pan-Indian set of assumptions regarding plants, right, that are shared by all Indian religions that are still very much alive today and which resemble very much the situation that Fabio describes for Japan. So plants are as either divine on their own or inhabited by gods, et cetera, or endowed with a soul. While on a popular register of Buddhism, we find those very same assumptions and stories about trees that have a soul, etc. On a higher scholastic elite level, what we see is mostly a very open denial of the almost the, you know, in general of the ontological dignity of plants, right? Buddhist monks are forbidden from destroying plants, but as Schmidhausen shows, like the texts are very clear. Buddhists should avoid doing that because it looks bad, because literally, because people in their social context considered plants sacred or considered destroying plants bad, but not because plants on their own have any special dignity. And I see this tied very much to Buddhist anthropocentrism. It's, the tradition describes how, although a human rebirth is not the most pleasant of all rebirths, it's ideal. It's the ideal kind of rebirth because it's the one that leads to enlightenment, right? So, by placing humans at the center of everything, this mainstream Buddhist doctrines hits the same roadblocks as, say, both modern positivist, ideology of progress or the doctrine of human rights against animal rights, environmental concerns, right? Yet, in spite of all of this, plants are really central to the imagery of Buddhism, right? Maybe Buddhism is the only major world religion that has plants as its major symbols, both the lotus that is ubiquitous is the symbol of reverence, and the Bodhi tree under which the Buddha attains enlightenment. And yet what I would suggest here is that, maybe a bit as in Dante, they are understood as pretty in decoration. They're just pretty. And here I would like to highlight the work of my own teacher, Gregory Chopin, who has shown that the spots for Buddhist monasteries and shrines were chosen for their scenic beauty. And he has brought to the fore these scriptural passages that show that the gardens of all these Buddhist monasteries were like very manicured, were by no means wild or natural in any way. They were like very, very manicured, right? And this brings me as a final consideration to the role of beauty in Buddhism. The oldest good Indian art and architecture, by Indian I mean like after the Indus Valley civilization, is all Buddhist, right? It's an unspoken part of the tradition that it has to be pretty, it has to be seductive and full of flowers and beautiful temples, etc. But again, I would see that in that sense, Dante and the mainstream Buddhist tradition are also very close, perhaps, in a way. And with this, I close my remarks.
Thank you very much, Diego, for doing such a wonderful job pulling everything together and providing new things to talk about as well. I'd like to open it up for questions now. You may raise your hand if you like, or if you would like, you can also put your question in the chat. I see one hand up from William Frank.
Good. Okay. Thank you. I'm going to have to. Oops, sorry. Now I think it's on. Thanks for calling. I'm going to have to leave in just a couple of minutes for class, but I would just maybe one small point first with plants on our minds. I just wanted to maybe remind us that actually I think plants can count as fallen as well. You know, there's all of nature falls together with Adam. The whole creation groaneth and travaileth in pain together until now, right? With the redemption of Jesus Christ, there is some suggestion really that it falls as a whole. And of course you have the animals in Isaiah who are killing each other, and that's no longer going to happen, right? The lion shall eat straw like the ox. That's just, you know, one other dimension on the Western side, I think that could be brought into that discussion. What I really wanted to take up was Vittorio's discussion of non-dualism. And the question I would ask, and I'm trying to remember what Christian Moevs says in his book, is there the theory of the two truths, which, you know, could be condemned, oh, that's dualistic, but on the other hand, we maybe need a distinction between a conventional truth, you know, within the world of polarities, and then some absolute truth. This was very current, of course, in the Middle Ages, and also very much, I think, in various styles of Buddhism. That might be a way of answering the kind of objection that Diego Lakota very, you know, reasonably articulates, that you know, everything in the empirical universe is illusion. It has its truth within its frame, but, you know, all of that is then relativized by relation to this other truth. Is it within the metaphysical perspective of Christian Moevs to speak in terms of two truths, or are we then going to fall into a dualism that is not acceptable? I think, you know, maybe we have to talk that way in order to sort of look beyond it. And, you know, I was going to end there, but, you know, you give us, that would be a sort of a cognitive distinction. You put it into ethical or moral terms and affective terms of a polarity between humility and pride. But of course, you're still working with a duality in order then to evoke what is beyond duality. And, you know, I suggest that maybe I think you inevitably have to do that. And the two truths theory would be just you know, a cognitive way of doing the same thing.
Is it right to respond?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you, William. It's great to be here together, although the space is a virtual one. And thank you for your question and for your work in general. I'd have to go back to Christian Moevs' book to check whether that is discussed. It doesn't come to mind. I think what we're working with, and I appreciate your suggestions, is really what would be the most helpful way, especially in this kind of scholarly context that we're inhabiting, most helpful way of distinguishing between different levels of understanding and different levels of experience, and as you were saying, different levels of cognition. When you were speaking, one thing that came to mind that I think so instinctively, I would have to think about this in more detail, but instinctively where I would go first, perhaps before a two truths kind of framework, would be to the kind of framework, if we can call it that is articulated, say, by the Pseudo-Dionysius in the mystical theology, where, you know, your dualities are posed so as to be negated as well. So you negate something of the divine, generating a duality of some sort, and then you sort of negate that as well. And so that in this sense, for example, with pride and humility, what would it mean to do that? What would it mean to think of it? Because you're right, I'm employing pride and humility, but that does maintain a duality, even if it is trying to move towards something. So then the question is, how would you articulate cognitively, the what you're moving towards? And that would be one of the places that I would sort of go to first. And yeah, so I think that's the other thing to do with illusion, and thank you, Diego, very much for that. I think in relation to Christian Moevs' work, I think it would be really interesting to take that question about the whole of the creative world as illusion to the final sections of Christian Moevs' book, where he deals with the distinction between truth and fiction, that I only dealt with sort of relatively briefly. Because to some extent, what I think one question to ask there is, what is the meaning we attach to the word illusion? From what perspective is it illusion? And again, if we're working within an intellectual framework, such an academic one, that necessarily we might approach things in a given way, but that might not necessarily be the kind of context that Dante is imagining. So sorry, I'm just raising more questions, but I think it's very important to address the kind of points you make and following from the ones that Diego made. So thank you both.
Truth and illusion cannot be divided either.
Yeah.
The questions also, of course, if Andrew and Lucia also want to respond to some of the issues that Diego raised, that of course is fine as well, or Vittorio.
Oh, that's okay. We can let others speak.
I actually had my hands up because I wanted to ask a question more than commenting on my own. Thank you, Diego, for highlighting some points. But I had a question for Vittorio, and I would be interested also in what William Franke says about the truth theory in the Middle East, in the Western Middle Ages, whatever. How do I put it? Diego was speaking of a different in language, but on the other hand, some of the things that Vittorio was pointing out are incredibly close in language. So my question is really, what is behind that language that you have used? You were talking of, at least if I understood that, I penciled down a couple of points. You were saying that to know God is to know oneself as God. Yeah. What does that actually mean in Dante or within Christian metaphysics? Well, ontology actually at that point. Or what does it mean that no subsistence given to individuals is there but in participation? So these would open up a very deep conversation with Buddhist ways of understanding participation in being part of the ultimate or of the truth, or being a God. This is my question.
Thank you. So in the first instance, where's the language coming from? To know God is to know oneself as God. That I was citing. I started from citing Christian Moevs' own work. I think where I would go to connect this kind of language, say to Christian theology, roughly sort of contemporary to Dante. Two examples that come to mind. One would be sort of Aquinas, question 12 of part 1 of the Summa Theologiae, where where he asks, what does it mean to know God? How can a human person know God? And he starts by basically what he does. He in order to answer the question, you need to undo the duality between subject and object when it comes to God. To know anything at all, human, either naturally or supernaturally, human beings need to, the human mind needs to sort of partake of the divine mind. Those are not exactly the terms that Aquinas uses, but in effect, to see God is not to see anything. It's to recognize one's own power of sight as sharing in divinity. So those are the kind of terms that Aquinas sets up. Bonaventure, there's I forget the exact reference in the Itinerarium, but the notion that, as sort of relatively simple but compelling in some ways, the notion that the light through which you see cannot become an object of sight. So that sense that there is, so I think in that sense, again, to see God is not to see anything, but to recognize your own sight as divine. In relation to participation, again, I think that is also, again, theologically, that would be tied to notions of sort of creation out of nothing, and sort of, again, it would be really interesting, as you say. I mean, and I don't have any sort of expertise in this area, but I think that there is certainly within the metaphysical and theological frameworks that Dante is inhabiting a really strong emphasis. It's there in Aquinas as well, that only in God existence and essence coincide. All things exist in a particular way, in this way or that way. Only in God essence and existence coincide. Only God is his own existence. Only God self-subsists in that sense. So yes, I think while in Moevs' work, the language Moevs himself uses is indebted to his own encounters with sort of Asian frameworks, which do not then, but do not get discussed extensively in the book. I do think that there are ways of connecting that language to sort of contemporary medieval theology. One could also go to, let's call it sort of more, what we today would call more mystical theology, whether it's Eckhart or others.
Cusanus, Cusanus,
Cusanus,
Visio
yes.
Dei, the vision of God is actually seeing as God sees, rather than as an object, right? It's sharing in the vision, the subjective envisioning of God. And the passage that you quoted, Christian Moevs actually qualified that seeing oneself as God is seeing with God or seeing in God, participating. I would say to Anton, Lucia, Dolce, I think that's really looking towards the absolute truth. And of course, then Benigni, whom Vittorio quoted, he brings it down to all of these particulars. I think that's an act of imagination as well. It's seeing, you could see everything in its minute, absolute particularity. I don't really think that you can represent all of that at once. I think it's making a statement about the unlimited power of perception rather than representing, what Dante sees all at once. Well, this is outside of time in any case. So, it's incorrect to really represent that as the truth that it is seen. And, but the seeing here is not an empirical seeing, it's metaphysical.
And thank you for that. And I think, sorry. Yeah.
No, go ahead.
And I think it, again, one important distinction I think that is there in Aquinas, and I think Dante would share, is that yes, there is this seeing as God sees, etc. But the distinction remains that no creature can see if not by participation. So no creature can see as God sees, as if they are the creator in a way. There's that distinction. All the creaturely seeing that participates in divinity remains creaturely seeing. Now, so these two is pardon?
The dichotomy remains there, at least
yes, But then you get, I think it's the Moevs' fourth principle that, you know, creator and creation are not two, but they are not the same. You know, and again, we come back to the question: what kind of language can we find to address these questions? And just sorry, one further thought, William, going back to the two truths. Again, perhaps another place where we can go would be thinking especially about sort of morality and virtue, going to the end of the Monarchia, Dante's notion of two ends, you know, sort of a temporal end and an eternal end. But that would take us into a different territory, I know, but I think that could be helpful to bring in.
Let me bring Fabio Ramelli, who has his hand up. Fabio.
Yeah, thank you. Since I was mentioned a couple of times, no, I would like to say a couple of things and also raise a question which is related to the conversation that we're having, I think. First of all, in terms of plants, or the Buddhahood of plants in Japanese Buddhism, there are several discourses. In fact, it's not only one. I mean, there are, you know, the plants are enlightened from the point of view of someone who's already enlightened, which implies a kind of, again, a non-dualism between the enlightened one and the environment in which the enlightened one exists. Or there is another theory according to which there is no distinction whatsoever. Everything is enlightened because of the very nature of things, you know, as being part of this cosmic Buddha. So everything is already part of that. So there are different theories, but all of these are related to some interpretations of non-dualism in Buddhism. And Lucia, of course, can say much more about this, but there are several visions of what non-dualism can actually mean. Now, in terms of plants, I very much appreciated Andrew's paper because I never thought of Dante, you know, I've never read Dante in that way. And it is true that, you know, plants are mentioned pretty much everywhere. So the question becomes, are plants like an essential component of the universe, or are they just furnishings of the universe? And I guess it can go both ways, right? And probably Dante is not very clear. I mean, it just uses all of these references. Well, Christian salvation is by definition only for humans, right? I mean, there's no doubt about it, you know, resurrection of the flesh, you know, all of that, you know, going up to paradise. Plants don't go there. But on the other hand, the plants are already there. If you think about the Rosa Mystica, you know, which all the saints, you know, participate. I mean, that is pretty much the shape of the of paradise, right? It's a flower, and which raises all kinds of interesting questions about, you know, whether plants are just, again, marginal furnishings or they're really essential to salvation. So, which brings me to another point, you know, are plants in the poem, like in the Divina Commedia, just metaphors for something else, or metonymies, or even indices, you know, because, you know, something that is really there in paradise, and therefore, which, you know, brings up all kinds of other things, which makes me think about, you know, Diego mentioned, you know, the understanding of plants in Indian Buddhism. And from what Schmidhausen argues, I mean, I think he's right. I mean, the Buddhists were very careful in India to separate themselves from existing religious and philosophical traditions. So they want to say, well, it sounds pretty much like what the Brahmins or the Jain are doing, but we are different. And so they had to be to negotiate their existence there. Now in Japan, that doesn't seem to be the case. I mean, the Buddhists didn't really have to differentiate themselves from anything else. In fact, they're very willing to incorporate like local traditions, local sets of beliefs and practices. So that might explain why plants were given a certain preeminence in Japan. So the issue is that for me now, so how about Dante? How important was for him to differentiate his own theology from like pagan thought, for example? We know that he has a very ambivalent relation to, I mean, Virgil is his guide, right? And so pagan thought, I mean, how different was it? How necessary was it for Dante to distinguish his own theology? How about, again, Judaism and Islam? Of course, they are criticized in the Divine Comedy, but, you know, you cannot really, in the Middle Ages, as far as I know, you cannot really think about Aristotle without the mediation of Averroes, for example, who was a Muslim, you know, thinker. right? And so how about popular cults, which were very, very important, and perhaps not even Christian cults, right? They were very important in Italy at the time, and some places still are. So this is, what thinking about plants, also implies, opens up the perspective, since we were talking since the beginning about, opening up the divine comedy and seeing spaces for interactions and development and openness. Non-dualism is one of them, right? So can we think about Dante in this other perspective, how he related to other traditions of thought?
Yeah, could I maybe respond to Fabio and a couple of other points? And maybe I'll just keep my remarks to three. One is starting from William Franke about how all of creation, groans in anticipation for, redemption. And I mean, I think Fabio is right that I think plants by definition cannot be fallen because they don't have sin, because they don't have volition, right? They didn't partake in the apple. There was no temptation, so there was no fallenness, and so there's still the Garden of Eden, right? And there's still the celestial rose, right? And yeah, and with the citation of the line that shall sleep with the lamb, I think that's just allegorical. Right? Or maybe you could say that it's typological for Christ, right? The Agnus Dei, right? Both the slaughtered as well as the priest, right? So I guess we have to think about animals in the economy of Christian salvation and sacrifice. Number two, both Diego and Fabio asked whether nature and plants are just marginal or essential in Christianity and Dante. Well, my paper is saying that no, it's essential in that plants are a part of us. We are a part of plants because according to ancient philosophy, our basis part is the vegetative. So we share in that organicism, right, with all living things. And I think one thing to collapse the distinction between marginal and essential is that, well, of course, nothing in Dante is marginal or exception, because even the most ornamental topoi and tropes he uses as a vehicle for his metaphysical system, right? And so a good way to think about this is the Greek notion of cosmos or cosmetics, right? And cosmos means both the furnishing, the decor, but also the underlying structure. It's the very principle of the universe. And in the principle of universe in non-dualism, there can be no differentiation between what is essential and what is non-essential. So substances and accidents collapse into one, right? And number three, with popular cults and what Diego was saying, well, how in Buddhist monasteries were founded in these kind of locus aeminus. Well, that also, I mean, obviously exists. There were tons of nature cults, right? Pagan and then kind of transformed into Christian nature cults. And in the rules of Saint Benedict, he says that, well, we should found monasteries outside the city center in landscapes, right, where we can contemplate the creation of God and where we can find peace and tranquility. And of course, there's the garden. I mean, Robert Harrison has talked about this, right? Paradiso, right? That's built in, like to basically in the Abrahamic religions, right? Paradiso, and actually being I mean, it's a Persian term, right, which is incorporated into Hebrew cosmology. Yeah, so those are the 3 points that I wanted to make.
Yeah. Are you sure you want to make fallenness a matter of the will?
Yeah, I don't know, William. I mean, that's a real question, and I want to think more about that, whether it's only human beings that are fallen or all of creation, right? I think, yeah.
We're maybe experiencing another kind of fallenness of nature right now.
Yeah, climate change, right?
Dramatic
exactly.
ways.
Right.
Thank you.
Any other questions? comments?
I'd like to ask a
Please go
question.
ahead.
Brenda, lots of very stimulating talks, and I have, and maybe this isn't for anybody particularly, but any one of you. So there are a couple of things. One was the quote from Paradiso 26, Le Fronde, the leaves. The question I have about it is Dante being interrogated, is talking about love, and he uses this leaf imagery. It's true, but it is in, first of all, there are neologisms in there, and synthronda. I don't think that, I think that's a made-up word.
Right. It's one of its many self-reflective verbs of.
Yes, and that for one,
like 20,
and two,
30, 40.
Exactly, and it's a reflexive, and it's put into this, therefore, eternal. So it's put into an eternal tense, which contrasts, of course, with the encounter with Adam, where everything is put in the past tense. In other words, contrasting the eternity, this gets into the question of these dualities, contrasting the eternal movement of love and God, the eternity, versus the fallen reality of humankind, which is discussed in the second part there. That's one question I have. And then the whole, you have to excuse me, I'm associated with Dante and the Orient. And so the question I have is, this has come up about Dante and other traditions and so on and so forth, is how do you deal with that interrogation about the man born on the banks of the Indus? And obviously, Dante is steeped in Islamic philosophy, which he's getting via the Christian tradition at that point. You know, it's been incorporated in some way, in many different ways, into the Christian tradition at this point. And he knows that. He's deeply aware of that. So, you know, yes, there are Muhammad's in hell, but Averroes and Avicenna are in limbo alongside all the other learned folks from whom he has learned. So that's to throw out there. And then, of course, the whole question of the salvation of pagans is a very, very open question in this period, very open. Maybe Dante is more conservative, I don't know. He leaves it, from my perspective, he leaves that question open, but others and more official figures are much, much more open than he is, including Bonaventure and Thomas Aquinas. So let any of you respond to that. It's open field here to both questions.
Brenda, hi, nice to see you.
Hi, nice to see
been a
you.
while.
By the way, nice to see everybody.
Maybe I can just tackle the first question. I think, you know, one of the most interesting and maybe underexplored things in Paradiso, and I guess William Franke has talked about it a little bit, is these self-reflective neologisms, right? And one way to think about this in relationship to plants is how plants can't ever have transitive verbs. They can't ever do anything because they don't have the principle. They can't eat, or well, they can eat things, but so they don't have locomotion. So they can't have transitive things, and so they can only have self, which is growth itself, right? And so I think maybe that's one small aperture in which we can think about these really wonderful neologisms, but it is interesting how plants by nature are in temporality, right? But you're in paradiso, in which, you know, this is which is already atemporal, and which brings us back to the question of the rose, right? If that's just metaphorical or kind of a metaphysical materiality of it. Okay, I'll stop myself here and let other people talk.
Thank you very much for those questions. The second question, you know, it's, you know, it'd be great to have much more time to talk about it. It's such an important question and such a central question in Dante. I think what I would like to say, simply to suggest there, is to, you know, what would it look like to include that question too in exploring non-duality, and especially in exploring non-duality, as Moevs suggests, in relation to thinking of the Commedia as inviting sort of a journey of increased sort of self-awareness, increased sort of awareness and sort of spiritual growth in, going back to the language we were exploring earlier, you know, knowing oneself as God in some way. My sense there is that Dante is, in a way, is being both more conservative than some of his contemporaries and more radical. And in the sense that he seems to be presenting us with a tension that throughout the Commedia, but there is particularly intense, throughout the Commedia, presenting us with a tension that ultimately is not resolved. And I really appreciate what you were saying about Dante leaves the question open. And that openness, I think, is connected to non-duality and invitation to spiritual journeying in the sense that it's the openness of the question is an invitation to recognize that the mystery of salvation is not external to ourselves. It's not simply something that the individual human mind can try and figure out and then represent. But Dante's work is often read like that, as if he's trying to represent salvation, as opposed to just thinking about what he presents, an invitation to realize how we are intimately and inextricably connected to the mystery of salvation. So that, for example, in that respect, I would give prominence to the relationship between Pope Gregory and the Emperor Trajan, and Gregory's prayers that bring Trajan out of hell so that he might be saved. Quite an extraordinary story put like that, but the deeper point that Dante seems to be making there, I think, is the sort of inviting us to recognize our own spiritual involvement as part of how these things unfold. So again, it's not something that we can stand outside of and look at objectively, ultimately. So that's just it's not an answer, but you know that's how I would begin to approach the question.
Well, I mean, after all, you have Ripheus up there in heaven, who's saved. I don't know whether you can hear me now. So.
Yep.
Which opens up the question, well, if we're only seeing famous people in wherever throughout the poem, we've been told that. So who knows who else is there, right? It's not clear, it's open-ended. It's very open.
Anyone else? I think we're going a little over time, but if there's another question or so, we can take it, or we can continue our conversation tomorrow. I just want to thank all three presenters and the discussant for a fascinating discussion today. When one organizes a conference like this, it's always with some tentative trepidation. So what is actually going to happen? But at least I'm very, very pleased with the way that this has gone today, and I look forward very much to tomorrow. So thank you all very much. I want to just hand it over briefly to Andrea so that he can give us a preview of tomorrow, maybe, and sign us off. Right. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Torquil. And I mean, thanks to the three speakers and Diego for responding to their talks. All very fascinating, and I too look forward to continue our conversation tomorrow. We'll start at 9 again. I think, you know, the three speakers and I mean, Paola, Fabio, and William will meet up a little earlier to test that you know, all the functions of Zoom work properly, and then you know, we'll have the talks, and then Brenda will respond to their papers. Again, thanks everybody. Wonderful conversation. Very much looking forward to tomorrow.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.